move us live. I think we can go live at any point. I would rather we go earlier than later, just to avoid any unpleasant issues.
We're live now.
Yeah, when you're ready, just move on.
Set taxonomy. So Colwell, as I said, is the secondary metabolite, and it was found first in E. coli strains carrying a
Hey, can you hear me?
gene cluster. And
Sorry.
what's so interesting about Colwell
Okay, great. I'm going to mute again. Thanks.
Oh, sorry, Ilya, I just saw the chat. This is Andrea. Can you hear me? Great.
Ilya, have you sent out a tweet this morning that I can retweet for any last minute listeners?
Tiara just tweeted something. Yes, you can retweet.
I think the link, I'm just sending it to the chat.
Great. All right.
All right. Welcome, everybody. It's 9:45, so it's time to start. I am Ilya Nemenman. I am the organizer for this workshop. I'm also a co-director of the Theory and Modeling of Living Systems initiative that is organizing this workshop. And I want to start with a few words of an introduction before we move to our feature, to the speakers. So the first thing that I would like to say is that we, of course, we very much apologize for the technical difficulties last week, and we're very happy that you could join us. So thank you for this. Now, a few words about the workshop. What is it about? What should you expect to hear about during this workshop? The main idea of the workshop is actually in its title. We have all seen the explosive growth of machine learning methods in analysis of experimental data from physics experiments from physical systems, but these methods have largely been focused on smart data preprocessing or on identification of things in data that we already know exists there ahead of time. These methods, machine learning methods, have not yet resulted in discovery of new physics, quote unquote new physics, whatever that means. That is, we currently know of no machine learning methods that, for example, can develop quantum mechanics based on observations of black body spectra, or to discover new physical laws which we haven't yet thought about, right? So this is a lofty goal, and it's unclear if this goal will ever be achieved, if we will ever be able to drive us, the theorists, out of business using machines. So today what we have done is we've assembled a group of speakers who have worked on applications of machine learning to physics, and these applications go beyond preprocessing and classification. They are designed to learn new laws of nature from experimental data, new things that we haven't necessarily known exist in this data. We'll hear from people who develop general methods and people who work on specific physical systems spanning areas as diverse as biophysics and quantum computing. Each talk will be 10 minutes, and it's followed by 10 minutes of questions. There are 8 panelists, 8 speakers, and they will ask questions of each other. And then at the same time, you can post on our YouTube live chat, and our group of dedicated student volunteers will filter the posts, and then they will relay them to me, to the moderator, and I will ask the questions of the speakers. The detailed schedule for the workshop is on your screen. You can probably see it right now. Notice that we'll take a break in the middle, and then there is also going to be the time for direct questions to all of the speakers as a group at the end. Also notice that some of the speakers on the schedule are marked with an asterisks, and these are people who are hiring postdocs, and you should feel free to contact them directly if you're interested in that. So a few final notes before we begin. First, we need to thank people who made this workshop possible. We are funded by the Emory College of Arts and Sciences through the initiative in Theory and Modeling of Living Systems, and we are funded in part by the National Science Foundation as a part of the Physics of Living Systems Student Research Network. My special thanks go to T.R. Ward, who has worked behind the scenes to make this workshop happen. And finally, this workshop is not the first and it's not the last in the TMLS virtual workshop series. You can watch the previous workshop on physics of behavior on our YouTube channel, and the next workshop is on motor control, which will happen on Friday, June 26, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern time. So join us for that one as well. And so now we're moving to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Alexandre Walczak from CNRS and École Normale Supérieure in Paris. And she will talk about generative models of immune repertoire. Thank you, Alex, please, you can share the screen now.
All right, so hi everybody, you can see my screen now? Yep, okay. So yes, we're going to start with applications. This is a very applied talk and a bit out of session, but sorry, I had strong scheduling constraints. So I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about how we've been trying to apply various methods, including machine learning, to immune repertoires. And this talk will have 2 parts, 2 short parts. The first part will be mainly work done by Giulio Zacchini in collaboration with people here, Quentin, Zach, Anita, Yuval, Kurt, and Thierry. And the second part is also in collaboration with Thierry Mora, but with Barbara Bravi, Remy Monasson, and Simona. All right, so first of all, the first part will be questioning how much do we get out of machine learning type models compared to sort of more traditional old-fashioned biophysical statistical inference. And so let me first introduce the problem a little bit. So what we're interested in here are immune repertoires. So you have an immune system, it protects you against various bugs. And the way it works is you have things like T cells. These T cells have receptors and they recognize pathogens. And you have a lot of T cells. You have a lot of different T cells with a lot of different receptors. And that's how you're able to be protected against many different pathogens. So one of the questions people ask is, if they look at any sample, what is the distribution of T cell receptors in this sample? And by sample, I mean a blood sample from a given person. So the way you can address it is through experiments and data. So you go in, you get a blood test, they pull out your T cells, they pull out the receptors on these T cells. Each T cell has a different kind of receptor. So the diversity of the T cell pool is well described by the diversity of the sample of the receptors, of course, modulo sampling, and then they sequence them. So you get data that looks like this. You get sequences of these T cell receptors that come out of the sequencer. And so you can do this in different data sets. And so then the question is, can you write the distribution of the different sequences that you get here? So the first thing you could do is you could actually ask yourself, where do they come from? Where does this diversity come from biologically? And that's what we did a while back. And so we looked at the biological process. There's a complicated biological process, which is called VDJ recombination, which I don't want to really go into in great detail. Bottom line is that the receptor is made out of 3 parts. You take, there's a certain number of templates for each of these parts, for V, D, and J. You take one of each, you put it together, you edit the DNA. And then there's some additional insertions and deletions that happen at the junctions. So we get a combinatoric part from assembling different, then you get additional randomness from the insertions and deletions. And this can generate a lot of diversity. In fact, we have of the order of 10 to the 9 different unique receptors. So if the name of the—
May I ask you, you have a build order window that is blocking a part of the bottom part of the screen, if you can remove it.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so if what you're trying to do is describe the diversity that's generated in this process, you can build a model which takes into account the biological knowledge that you pick a V, you pick a D and J in a correlated way. I won't describe why that is. And then you have some deletions and insertions at the junction. And then you can come up with an expectation maximization algorithm, which sums over all the possible scenarios that lead to a given receptor sequence. And by solving this expectation maximization problem, you find the elements of this probability distribution. And then by summing over these scenarios, you find the sum, you find the probability of generating any given sequence. So that's how they're generated. And on top of that, you later biologically know that there's a selection process. So you can do a similar procedure for the selection process. At the end of the day, what you get is you get a probability distribution, you get a meta distribution. So you can ask how you can look at the density of having sequences that had a given probability of generation. So that will be the blue line before this selection process, so that's just for this process of generation, and the red line how this shifts after selection. But basically what this tells you is that there were how many sequences in your sample were there that had a probability of 10 to the minus 10 to be generated, and so on. So you make a distribution like that. These are the kind of objects we'll be looking at. But bottom line of this, you put in a lot of biological knowledge into the probability distributions, and then you solve it. Alternatively, what Eric Madsen and his collaborators did about a year ago is they said, let's forget about any of this biological knowledge and let's build a variational autoencoder and see whether we can use that to generate receptors from this distribution. So they take the same kind of data, they take a bunch of sequences and they use it as input into this variational autoencoder. So there's an encoding and a decoding part. You basically map this to a reduced representation in a latent space, and you produce new sequences. So for each input sequence, you produce an output sequence, and then the name of the game is that the sequence that you produce in this compressed representation So x hat is as close to the one that you put in, which is x. And so in the learning step of the autoencoder, there's basically there's deep neural nets on both of these sides that you use, and you optimize the parameters to find the best fit between these. But unlike in other autoencoders, what the VAE does is it has an additional constraint. So it doesn't really care about living in a low-dimensional space. It actually, this latent space can be high-dimensional, but but you demand that it's that the latent, the hidden variable is chosen from a Gaussian distribution. And what this allows you to do is that it turns it into a generative model. So at the end of the day, when you've actually learned the parameters of this autoencoder, you can then generate from this hidden distribution. And so that's that's the VAE. And so that's what Eric Madsen and his collaborators did. And what it gives you is it gives you the same thing as the procedure I described before. So you can ask how many receptors that you put in, you put in data as input. So you're still asking about these receptors. So how many receptors had the probability to be generated? That's 10 to the minus 10 and so on. So we get the same kind of distributions. And so we basically have two ways of going from the data to this kind of distribution, which tells us what's the probability of generating any other sequence. One is traditional, the VAE, and the other one is is our model. So you can then compare the performance of the two methods, and essentially they perform in the same way. Maybe the VAE does a little bit worse, but there are no significant differences. So you can see the DKLs or the rho squareds are very similar. I'd say maybe a little bit worse, but I wouldn't make a big deal out of it. The main difference is really that the traditional model, which we're calling Sonia, so the biophysical model, is really an order of magnitude faster to train than the VAE. So on the one hand, I think here we were a little bit surprised that the VAE manages it all. So I think that's good news, because you have this choice of using a model that you don't know anything about. But on the other hand, it doesn't do any better than a very simple biophysical model, and it takes a long time. All right, so that was my first story. My second story, I guess I should hurry up, is about interpretable models, machine learning models, and similar problems. So here what we have is a different side of the same problem. We're again thinking about immune repertoires. This is now our T cell. And what a T cell recognizes when it recognizes a pathogen is, in fact, it recognizes a bit of pathogen, we'll call it an antigen here, which is presented on something called an HLA type. And so these are basically it's a presenting machinery. And we all have 6 different HLA types. And it's a very polymorphic science. And what gets presented is, to a first approximation, and a protein, a short peptide, which is 9 amino acids long. And there's a big question in the field: when you get these viruses, these pathogens, which peptides will be presented, and which peptides will be presented on which HLA. So that's what we try to answer. And that's what the other people had tried to answer before. But what we did is we devised machine learning method, which is based on restricted Boltzmann machines, that is able to solve this problem with small amounts of data and in a patient and experiment specific way. So basically you get a bunch of sequences, which are these 9 amino acid peptides, and then you use unsupervised models, so the RBM, to map it into, again, some reduced representation space. And as I'll show you, in this representation space this latent space has some advantages, right? So we get our sequences, we build an RBM, which is generally a generalization of something like an Ising model to feature space. And then we just have one layer of a network, and we go to a latent space. And if you look at if you cluster the inputs to this latent space, you find that they actually cluster. So what you gain from doing this is you find an underlying structure where you have structure that was not visible in the original sets. And then, so since you have this then representation space, you can, because of this clustering, you can use it, and it's much easier to build a classifier in it. So that's what the second step of what we do is, we build a classifier in this latent space. And it turns out that these clusters correspond to different HLA types. So this is something that's not put in, that comes out. In the classifier state, we do a little bit of supervision to help it, but the clustering comes out alone. So, and then if we look at each of the elements, we see that we can identify motifs, so the peptides that are most likely to be presented by them, and that this method does better than other methods, which are actually deep methods. So the thing I want to sort of accentuate here is that this is not a deep method. And thanks to the RBM, it's both generative and interpretable. So we have this interpretation in terms of clusters. And then we can apply it to different data and show that it is actually able to discriminate between antigens that are presented and not. And we can figure out which antigens are presented by different people for COVID and do other things like that, which I'm guessing you don't really care about. But I guess what I want to say with the second part is that you don't have to do something terribly fancy, but sometimes it's maybe useful to have some hold on a model that is a machine learning model, but still interpretable, so that you can go back and then build intuition and do something with it. So in my experience, it's not always the greatest thing to do a machine learning thing, although sometimes it's useful, and it's especially useful when you actually lack intuition. And what interests me personally is then trying to go back and bringing back to more interpretable models. Okay, thank you. I'm done. I can't hear you.
Thank you, Alex. So I think we have a couple of questions on YouTube. The first one actually comes from Sam. Sam, would you just unmute yourself and ask it?
Yes, of course. Thanks for the talk, Alex. It's very interesting. I was curious regarding part one, like looking into the long term, what are you excited about this technique that it could bring to the table besides perhaps speed or accuracy, which seem to be sort of the positive traits of the baseline model?
So I think what I want to, actually, thanks for the question, because there's something I did forgot to say also. I think it would have been very hard to formulate the right question for the machine learning method without having done the old school method first. So the machine learning method was clearly proposed as a method which says, I can do the same thing with machine learning that you guys had to think about. That's more or less what's written in the paper. And so I think sometimes, sometimes we can go further, and actually that's what we're trying to do now. Now we're saying, okay, so now we know that machine learning can work on these kinds of methods, that deep nets can help us. Well, let's try and take it further and add it on top of the baseline to see whether we can extract features that we could not have guessed before. And that's what I'm excited about, and that's what we're trying to do. So I think the marriage of the two is great. I mean, I sort of, felt there's no need to kick open doors that are already open, but you can go further, and I think that's neat. But what I really want to say, what I learned from all of this is that it's not so easy to formulate the right machine learning question, like a right question for a machine learning model.
Very cool, thank you.
So the next question that we had online is, does the hidden representation in the VAA represent the biological priors used in the biophysical model? So I guess maybe what's the relation between the two?
No.
No.
And
Simple answer.
there's no interpretation, so that it's a black box.
Okay. And how does one decide the size of the latent representation space?
By trial and error.
Okay. Another question is from Leonid Mirny. So it looks like the models in the model is not very specific. Some of them look like K in position 2 and L in position 9. Would just computing frequencies of different letters in different positions be as informative?
For the second part, he means probably, yeah.
Probably, he didn't quite say.
No, you do better than a PWM. If that's basically what he's asking. So
I know as well as you do what he's asking. So another question that is online is, what are the advantages of RBM instead of k-nearest neighbor methods? The generative ability of RBM, or is it something else?
Yeah, so okay, so I think, and this ties back maybe to Leonid's question also. So okay, so what you could do is you could just take the sequences and you could cluster them, right? That's what k-means would do. But in fact, in the simple space, in the input space, the sequences don't cluster. So what the RBM does is it maps your sequences to latent space where they cluster, and that's the main advantage. Okay, so the classification task, so it's a higher, well, it doesn't cluster in the space, but the input to the space clusters. The advantage of the latent space is that you get the clustering, and that helps to build a classifier, which would be much harder. And I think this also answers Leonid's question, because if you would just calculate frequencies to get the logos, well, I mean, first of all, you wouldn't get the HL. You'd have to either put in the HLA as knowledge. So without that, you wouldn't get the clustering. If you do that, then I mean, that's half of the problem solved. And the second thing is, well, more than half of the problem solved. The second thing is, yeah, you wouldn't recover. So you're using this latent space, which is able to sort of capture features that real space doesn't.
Okay, so I don't see there are any other questions, but I'll ask one myself, right? So I guess the dream of some of the people, maybe uninitiated in biophysics or in machine learning methods, is that somehow almost magically machine learning will solve our physics problems, just some black box algorithm. And I personally don't believe that it will work. And so we need to put some domain knowledge by hand to make it work, right? As you said, marry the things. And could you explicitly tell us like what it is that you had to put into your models to actually get them to work and to produce some interesting insight?
I think this takes us back to my answer to Sam, that you have to ask the right question. And as I said, I really think with the VAE, the question, once you ask the question, the biophysical approach is in a way, well, maybe it's natural. But in a way, thinking about trying to build a biophysical approach helps you ask the question. I mean, people have known about repertoires and have been doing some kind of sequencing ever since sequencing has existed. Of course, data explosion helped build more specific models. But it's really thinking about the process that led us to produce the answer in terms of what, and ask the question, what's the probability of generating a given sequence? Okay, it's not because we're so smart or anything, it's just we thought about the process per se. Whereas if you think about, I just want to throw machine learning at this problem, that may not be the first question you're going to ask. Okay, and then the same thing in the RBM, we wanted a generative model. In a way, you can say that this clustering is we were not after clustering, we wanted a generative model for prediction.
Well, okay, thank you very much, Alex. This was great. I really enjoyed this, and we need to move on to the next talk. I want to tell everybody that if you're just joining us, you can ask questions in the top chat on YouTube Live, and those questions will be relayed to me, and then I will relay them to the speakers. the next speaker is going to be David Schwab from the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City, and he's going to talk about renormalizing data. David, it's all yours. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ilya. Can you see my screen? Yeah? Okay, great. So first I want to thank Ilya for the invitation and for organizing such a unique event. It's not often one gets to think about big picture ideas, especially in front of an audience of many hundreds of people, no less. So I also want to briefly give my perspective on the question of learning new physics versus building it in by hand, sort of following the discussion that we just heard. I don't think I don't think my perspective is controversial, but I think in recent years we've been spoiled by how well neural networks work. That is generalized on the kinds of data we've mainly used them on so far. And thus we haven't had to think too hard about the inductive biases that are built into the models, either intentionally or unintentionally. As we consider learning physics or biophysics with machine learning, I think it's really important that we try to understand it and be as explicit as possible about the inductive biases and assumptions that we're building into the methods. Okay, so on to the topic of my talk, which is renormalizing data. So in physics, extracting relevant features or properties of data usually requires a model of the system we're studying. In particular, the renormalization group in the framework of statistical physics is a methodology for extracting macroscopic properties of a many-body system, as well as the control parameters of the model that matter, or you might call relevant. So if you wanted to use RG on data, one thing you could do is you could pick a model and fit it to your data, and then use RG to coarse grain the model. The question I want to think about today instead is whether it's possible to do something analogous without a model. I'll give you a proposal for what we think makes sense, but I'm not actually going to show you any results today, just to temper your expectations. So first, let me remind you of how RG typically works. In statistical physics, you start with a Hamiltonian describing your many-body system, which has all sorts of parameters k. You then come up with a scheme to coarse grain the model, resulting in a description of the coarse grain degrees of freedom that you try to put back in the same form as the original model. This new model will have some new parameters k prime, and you thus have a mapping from the set k to the set k prime. And if you imagine iterating this, you then get a flow in parameter space, and you can think about this sort of as trying to describe your system while putting on increasingly fuzzy glasses and stepping further and further back. So here's what those flows might look like. On the top, if you have a model like the 2D icing model describing a magnet, if the coupling between neighboring spins is weak enough, the system looks eventually like it has no coupling at all. If the coupling is strong enough, it looks like the coupling is infinite. And there's an unstable fixed point in between that separates the two behaviors. On the bottom, for models with more parameters, the kinds of flows you observe are richer and of course live in higher dimensions. It turns out that some parameter combinations are important for the ultimate fate of the flow, while others are irrelevant. So many years ago, my good friend Pankaj Mehta and I realized that there was a similarity between a certain flavor of RG and a machine learning technique that was extremely popular in the late 2000s. At the time, people were trying to find good initializations for neural networks by using an unsupervised pre-training task. And this seminal paper by Jeff Hinton's group described a technique for sort of layer-wise training of a multi-layer generative network using a model called a restricted Boltzmann machine that Alex was just talking about. I won't go into the details, but the layer-wise fitting of these RBMs turns out to be extremely similar to a variant of RG that Kadanoff was exploring in the mid-1970s. So again, I don't have time to describe this in detail, and it's not the main point of this talk. But very briefly, Kadanoff was trying to coarse grain a microscopic model by introducing a coupling T to some coarse grain variables. And he wanted to do so in such a way that the new variables don't mess up the physics, but they also have to help make the problem tractable. And since tractability is non-negotiable, he tries to minimally disrupt the physics. It turns out that the objective that both Kadanoff and Hinton and company were trying to achieve at each stage is essentially the same, with a big difference that Kadanoff works with a microscopic model, but Hinton works directly on data. So this connection is interesting, but I think it's fair to say that it's a connection between an antiquated yet elegant idea in machine learning and a formulation of RG that was never particularly useful. Nonetheless, it perhaps hints at a more general and fruitful connection between neural networks and coarse graining in physics. And for the rest of the talk, what I want to do is change gears a bit and think about how we could frame RG more directly from a learning perspective, with the eventual aim of doing RG directly on data. So RG needs a notion of relevance, and to formalize it, we're going to use the information bottleneck. In IB, you assume that you know what's relevant, and you have a joint distribution between some input data X and what matters about X, which we'll call Y. The goal of IB is to find a coarse graining or encoding of X that preferentially keeps relevant information while throwing away irrelevant information. To formalize this, IB minimizes a Lagrangian that trades off removing information in the representation about the input while retaining the relevant information. And a Lagrange multiplier beta encodes that trade-off. The problem is, in physics, we don't necessarily have a target label Y for every input that we, in the same way that we often do in machine learning. And the question is, what can we use as the predictive objective? A natural idea for this was explored in this Nature Physics paper, where the authors imagine encoding a patch of a physical system, V, by maximizing how much information the encoding has about the rest of the environment. And this is an interesting idea, but we think it suffers from two drawbacks. First, there's no bottleneck term that explicitly encourages throwing away information about V. As a result, the encoding might retain irrelevant microscopic information. Secondly, it's sort of incongruous to ask the encoding Z to make predictions about the microscopic state of the environment E. Rather, the encoding should be asked to predict the encoding of the environment. Also, estimating the information the encoding has about the environment at a microscopic level requires building a model of the microscopic environment, which is itself a hard task. So what we would like to propose does these two things differently. So again, first we explicitly bottleneck the encoding of a region to remove as much microscopic information as possible. And we ask the representation to make predictions about the encoding of the rest of the system rather than of the microscopic state of the rest of the system. So altogether, we propose that a learnable objective for a data-driven RG should look something like this, which trades off compression and prediction like IB. And while you can work through the formal solution to this problem in the tabular setting, scaling it up to real-world data sets directly isn't feasible. So what you can do instead is use upper bounds to the objective using some techniques that have been developed in machine learning. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I'm not going to show you results, but stay tuned. I will say that so far we've explored this on machine learning tasks and found that adding the bottleneck doesn't necessarily increase performance, but rather maintains performance while reducing the amount of information that goes into the representation. I should also mention that this particular noise contrastive bound makes the objective extremely similar to what has become one of the hottest areas in machine learning this past year, namely contrastive learning. So here are two examples of contrastive learning objectives. The first on the left, contrastive predictive coding, makes patchwise encodings and predictions. And what I've suggested as a data-driven RG is essentially a bottlenecked version of CPC in a sense. The SimCLR paper on the right generalizes the notion of what data each encoding sees to allow for a large set of data augmentations, that is crops, rotations, color jitter. And this broadening beyond patches is essential for problems where relevance is something other than long wavelength physics that you want to build in. So maybe I'll close with this, a speculation in the spirit of this event. In some sense, the hope of this event is to learn what's relevant without putting it in by hand, and perhaps by incorporating a bottleneck, we can get away with only telling the objective what we think is irrelevant and have it learn the views, i.e. learn what's relevant on its own. Probably not, but maybe. So let me take a minute to acknowledge the people who have shaped my views on these topics. In particular, Wave, who is currently a postdoc at CUNY, has been working hard to make these ideas work. And the idea for an IB-based RG was originally a summer undergrad student that Andrew Tan worked on before he started grad school at MIT with Max. And I think we'll hear something about him later. So thank you. I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. So we have a few questions, and I'm going to start asking them and add a few of my own. Mm-hmm. So the first question comes from William McCarkendale. How do you define local features? And let me try to also rephrase this a bit. All of this pictures that you have shown, they have a notion of space, locality, right? If you're trying to apply these things to unstructured, let's say, biological data where you're looking at sequences, it's not clear what is local. Or if you're looking at social interactions, it's also not clear what is local. There is no space there. So how would the methods that you propose work if you cannot define a local patch?
The formulation as I described it first, it wouldn't work. You would need to be able to know what is local, what is not local, and in some sense, what do you think is irrelevant? What would you like to compress? It may be possible many steps down the road to modify the objective to learn the views. Learn what you mean by patches or data augmentations in the more general sense, but that's much further down the road.
Okay. So the next question is from Julian Urban. What is the equivalent of large momentum cutoff that one usually introduces to regularize integrals in statistical physics quantum field theory? Is it implicit somehow in the coarse grained procedure?
Let's see. I mean, in some sense, by asking to remove the microscopic information, the sort of bottleneck term on the input, is trying to act like a cutoff and remove information if possible, while still making long wavelength predictions.
Okay. Samir Abraham is asking if you can maybe give us a bit more intuition behind this information Lagrangian that you have shown, maybe just a bit more detail for those who are not initiated in information bottleneck.
The idea is that the precise configurations locally may contain a lot of information that are not useful for making predictions about the system very far away, and you would like to compress and extract out just the bits that allow you to make the predictions that you want to make, and otherwise get rid of the irrelevant information.
Okay, Sam, you have a question, but you can ask that on your own. I don't have to relay it for you.
Again, hi David, thanks for the talk. I was just curious about the connection between so like existing, I guess, like dimensionality reduction techniques like say PCA, and then there seems to be a similar motivation for the renormalization group, basically to extract lower dimensional representations of a system without a model. So is there a connection, and what might that be?
Let's see, I would say that in both cases, what you do is you say, there's something that I care about. In the case of RG, it's long wavelength physics, and in the case of PCA, it's variance. And then you try and fit a model that captures that structure about the distribution that you're interested in, and not necessarily anything else.
Do you have a follow-up, Sam?
No, just thank you.
Okay. Okay, a few more questions are coming in. So Amitava Banerjee is asking, is it possible to extract simple physics differential equations like the Landau-Ginzburg equation with the long wavelength modes from the neural network layers?
I don't have anything intelligent to say about that question, unfortunately.
Okay.
It looks like Bryan on the call has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to get to Ilya's question, original question, which was, do we have to build in the physics that we want? And so in a certain sense, I mean, you're saying that we have to define sort of the question that we want to ask, that is to say, what is the relevant thing that we're interested in? And I think that it will require us to put that in, right? That we'll never get to a point where it just, it's sort of a hitchhiker's guide, like is giving us a 42, but we don't know what the question is. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And in some sense, that's one of the things that I think is promising about this formulation, is that it allows you to be explicit about putting that in and saying, this is what I care about, this is what I don't care about, and then see what you get, rather than pick a model that has inductive biases that you might not fully understand, and yeah, then it's harder to interpret.
Okay, so a few more questions. So
Nice.
Among who says, very interesting talk. I'm interested that can this information principle based renormalization group distinguish relevant operators and irrelevant operators if I add those as perturbations to the model?
So that's a statement about models, and here I'm trying to do a data-driven RG that never makes a reference to a model. So I'm not sure exactly how to formulate that question. I guess the idea would be that if you had a model that you were generating data from, and you gave irrelevant perturbations, then you would expect the same result from this method. Whereas if you changed relevant parameters, you would expect to see that in the method.
So maybe I would like to follow on that myself, right? So in some sense, the beauty of model-based methods is that they're interpretable, right? You can look at those few elements, few features, and say, look, this is a magnetic field, it's a relevant thing, right? And so on. If you just try to do the analysis based on data alone, how do we get interpretability into the system? How do we actually learn something about the system besides just saying that there is a very large dimensional, potentially hidden representation that carries the information?
I'm not sure I can say anything generic about that question. I think it depends on the particular application that you're working in. There are things that you can do with the representation that you learn to try and follow through the same procedure as if you were doing RG on a model. I'm not sure that the ideas that people have come up with yet are the best way to do it, but you can certainly approximate that. But I think in general that depends on the question you're trying to ask.
Can you actually derive a model using this type of methods?
I haven't thought about that.
Would I be able to get the 5-4 theory, if I were to apply it to some measurements of magnetization in a
so this is explicitly trying not to build a model of the microscopics, if that's what you mean. So I don't think you can actually back out a model of the underlying system.
Well, I mean, there are more questions coming in, but we'll still have time, 15 minutes at the end of the whole workshop for asking questions for all of the speakers. And for now, I'd like to thank David again very much for a provocative talk. And we'll move to our next speaker, Sam Greydanus from Google Brain. And again, you can all ask questions on the YouTube live on the top chat there.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sam Greydanus. Thank you, Ilya, for the introduction. My talk today is titled Nature's Cost Function. And with that, I'm going to jump right in. First and foremost, I'd like to thank my 4 collaborators, amongst others, who helped contribute to this work. And in terms of the outline for this talk, I'm going to begin by covering a bit of just a perspective on physics through the ages. So the ancient Greeks were very optimistic about physics. So we have Aristotle saying things like, we must advance towards what is more clear and more knowable by nature. And in a large part, Isaac Newton agrees. He says things like, to myself, I'm only a child playing on the beach, aspects of truth lie undiscovered for me. Again, very optimistic. But to some degree, mood changes in the 20th century as physicists begin to grapple with quantum indeterminacy. So here we have Niels Bohr saying, physics is not about how the world is, it is about what we can say about the world. And the implication here is that we cannot say everything there is to say about the world. Very different subject. And then by the time we get to Richard Feynman, we're saying, shut up and calculate. So to a large degree, that's what the past couple decades have been about, shutting up and calculating. And this has given us this vast galaxy of new scientific literature and quite a few significant breakthroughs. So here we're visualizing a bunch of papers on the archive related to physics, and they're sort of grouped by different topics in physics. So on one hand, this is really good because we're producing new scientific knowledge. But on another hand, we have this quandary where we wonder, like, how much is each paper really doing? And there's a claim to be made that modern physics is perhaps over-specialized, over-complicated, and overly incremental. But Feynman might be proud because there's lots of computation going on. So as modern physicists look around for perhaps the next big step in physics, many of us are wondering if there is ways in which exciting new fields such as deep learning can help. And my answer to this question is a resounding yes, with the qualification that we have to be very, very careful how we do it because there's lots of bad ways of doing it. But my answer is based on the premise that optimization and physics are not quite so different from one another as they would seem at first glance. So here's a diagram of a particle interacting with a gravitational field over time. And we know from physics that this particle circumscribes a parabolic trajectory, as shown here. And yet there's a set of interpretations in physics, which we often call Lagrangian mechanics and such, that say, well, that particle could take any number of different paths, and yet the amplitudes of those paths actually occurring, the probability amplitudes are very small. And the reason that we actually end up taking the parabolic path is that it minimizes like this scalar value, which when minimizes, or I get at least when there's a stationary value of this scalar value, we get the physics that nature is most likely to take. And so this starts to look very much like nature's cost function. So let's just dive into this for a second. What is this cost function? Well, in the literature, we call it the action. Technically, it's defined by S, which is a functional. It's an integral over time of the difference between kinetic energy T and potential energy V. We often call the difference in these Lagrangian. And just to visualize this further, we again have a system moving from Q0 to Q1. This system could take any of those lavender paths, which are all valid, valid paths in different worlds of physics. And yet, like, we know that the system will take the red path because it actually minimizes this value of S. In other words, it's sort of like the solution to this optimization problem. Okay, so much of my work has been built upon those underlying intuitions. And actually, I'm optimistic that we can push these intuitions much further than I already have. So now let's talk about my recent work. My most recent paper is called Lagrangian Neural Networks. And the idea here is to basically enforce the fact that the action is minimized. In other words, there's an equation in physics called the Euler-Lagrange equation. And when you enforce that, you basically force, the action to be minimized. So a regular neural network doesn't do this. Here we have a diagram where, say, you collect a bunch of data of a double pendulum. We observe basically the state over time. And then we train a neural network basically to model the dynamics. And then we sort of infer the future dynamics given the data. But the difference we're doing in this paper is we parameterize the Lagrangian with a neural network. And then we basically enforce the fact that action is minimized implicitly. And this like very, very generic bias over physics allows us to basically learn to conserve a quantity, and that quantity ends up being very similar to the total energy of the system. So it's a really nice bias, and what it buys us is a much better ability to model the system. So if you're a bit more visual, here's a movie of 2 simulated double pendulums. We're basically using neural networks to obtain these dynamics in both cases. And at first, both systems appear to have the same amount of total energy if you just inspect it. And then over time, you'll notice that the baseline neural network actually hits a very low energy state right here. And meanwhile, the Lagrangian network sort of continues chugging along similar energy levels. And sort of the overall theme here is that we're learning to conserve a scalar value. This is enforced by enforcing the Euler-Lagrange equation. And work by Emmy Noether tells us that, well, every symmetry that has a corresponding conservation law, every symmetry has a corresponding conservation law, and vice versa. So if we're learning to conserve a quantity, then we're also learning a symmetry of the system. And we're doing this from data. So, you know, symmetries and conservation laws are sort of the foundation on which theoretical physics is built. So we can view this as like bringing closer together the fields of like experimental data analysis and like actual scientific theory. So very exciting. And then a second observation is that there's this thing called the Legendre transform. It basically lets us move between the Lagrangian and Hamiltonian formalisms. And if you're not all that familiar with Lagrangians and Hamiltonians, I think of them sort of as like Cartesian versus polar coordinates. So they're both trying to get at like the same underlying concept. In this case, the concept is like conservation laws. And yet there are different ways of talking about it, and they each sort of have their pros and cons. So a natural question is, can we learn Hamiltonians directly? And well, the answer is yes. This is a paper I wrote about a year ago now called Hamiltonian Neural Networks. And the diagram is pretty similar. So once again, a baseline neural network is able to model the dynamics, although imperfectly. So this phase-based plot should be a perfect circle, but it's a bit more of a spiral. And then if you parameterize a Hamiltonian, which again sort of relates to like enforcing a physical network, you're then able to exactly conserve a scalar value, which is shown here as like the little circle on top, it's h theta. And even as the inputs to the network move, as the dynamics change, the output of the network will stay exactly constant. And this is sort of shown here by our model staying on the same energy manifold of the phase space plot. Very exciting stuff. Just to visualize this a bit further, we have a 2-body system here. And the baseline network sort of quickly loses energy, does weird stuff, and the Hamiltonian network more or less conserves energy. If you visualize this, dig a little bit deeper and plot energy, the blue line on the bottom right plot shows that the total energy of the system is more or less conserved. You'll note that it's slightly different from the actual total energy in that the model has to learn the equations of energy directly from the coordinates of the system. So it's something very close to the actual total energy. Cool, and you can do some really funky stuff with these methods. So here, the coordinate system of the physics is actually the pixels of an image. So you point your camera at a pendulum, and you basically then use the video you've taken as inputs to a Hamiltonian neural network. And you can actually learn conservation laws for the energy of the system straight from pixels. So in a sense, we're sort of getting physics from pixels, although there's a lot of like details I've swept under the rug here. Cool, and with my remaining time, I want to talk about the frontiers of the idea of physics as optimization. So the first thing that we really want to do is apply the Lagrangian and Hamiltonian learning to more specific data sets. And here I'm just showing, this is a data set of solar system motions from the 1970s till now. It's called the ephemeris data set. And you could imagine writing a Lagrangian for this system. And then there's going to be some discrepancy in between your Lagrangian and like the actual observed patterns of the planets. And then if you used a neural network to sort of you may indeed be able to come up with like the relativistic correction to that Lagrangian. And so that's just like a fun toy example, which I think may work. And then I think you could actually apply this to other more like frontier to our theory. And then zooming out, something I'm like generically very excited about is like just the notion of physics as optimization. So Lagrangians and Hamiltonians are a common language across an increasingly fragmented and specialized field, which is modern physics. So Lagrangians are a way for people who study ocean physics to talk to people who study cosmology, who talk to people who study condensed matter physics, in that it's one of the few universals that we all can agree upon. Second off, it unifies quantum and classical physics in a very beautiful manner, which I don't want to go into too much, but essentially at the quantum scale, you know, there's more than one path that nature may take, but then as you zoom out, that sort of like becomes one path. It's just like a very nice way of like unifying these two perspectives. And finally, the idea of physics as optimization is not boring. It's fresh. It's a new way to see the world. And I think that alone can encourage people to do new and creative research. So I'd very much encourage others to join me on this journey. And my final question is, how much further can we push this idea? So thanks for listening. And I'd like to now answer any questions you all might have.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for a very nice talk. Anybody of the panelists, do you have any questions before I move on to the YouTube live questions? Okay, since nobody seems to be unmuting themselves, let me start with this. Sorry, I missed the I just had this question. Okay, yes. So Frederica Campos Freitas asks, can machine learning extract an equivalent of the action in an unknown system, right? Maybe trying to expand on this a bit, I would change, supplement this question. What if your action does not look like squares of velocities, or you know, what happens if there is no action or no conservation of energy because there are some dissipative forces and so on?
Great. So I love the way this person is thinking. So the way to look at the research I've done so far is that we're enforcing, like, we're making this into a constrained optimization problem where we're enforcing the fact that the action is minimized or that a quantity is conserved. The question here is asking, I think, about whether we can learn a quantity analogous to the action. So basically, like, there's a quantity that's minimized across different physical systems. And this quantity is given by, you know, these two energy values, or there's like a relationship between the energies. So that first part of the question, that's really hard to do. It's certainly possible. And then the second part of the question sounds a little bit different. There's something about dissipative forces. I think that's sort of an orthogonal direction.
It's a question from a different person. This is Arijit Sekhanovic. I apologize to everybody if I cannot pronounce the names. I'm very sorry. So I'll try to merge two questions. Can you deal with cases where the energy is not conserved, like systems where there is dissipation of energy?
Yeah. So that's something I want to publish. But I think it's possible. It's a little bit difficult because you probably need more data. The do it is basically you have one model that is not dissipative, and then you have another model that is dissipative, and you want to basically model dissipative forces with one model and then non-dissipative model forces with the other. And then you start by basically learning the two jointly over your data. And then you regularize the contributions from the dissipative model to be as small as possible. So that way you're taking into account the dissipative forces, but you're like biasing your system towards like obeying a set of conservation laws that we suspect to be universal.
Okay. Is it possible to identify symmetries in the Hamiltonian neural network since it manages to learn to conserve energy? This is a question from Santosh Manika.
Can you repeat the first part where you mentioned symmetries?
Is it possible to identify symmetries in the Hamiltonian neural network since it manages to learn to conserve energy?
Okay, nice question again. In theory, it is entirely possible. In practice, neural networks learn very strange functions. And so these symmetries are going to be extremely high dimensional. So they won't be symmetries like, rotation across a single axis in 2 dimensions. And I think what you need to do eventually is like regularize the Hamiltonian or Lagrangian network to be very, very simple. And there may even be like a symbolic regression component to it, at which basically you want to decrease the dimensionality of that symmetry. I think there's something about Lie groups here where you like want the Lie group to be really low dimensional before you can like understand what that symmetry is. So yeah, we're learning symmetries. They're just very high dimensional right now.
So John Bastola is asking, how well does Hamiltonian inference via the neural network approach scale as the dimension of the problem space gets larger?
Yeah, it scales pretty well. So you saw we worked with pixel data. That's a two-step process where you like encode high dimensional data like an image into like a latent space like that of a VAE, and then you sort of learn your physics in that latent space. But then the implication here is that you can like use different coordinate systems and sort of learn canonical physics sort of regardless of your coordinate system.
So I'll ask another question. So as examples of which you've used, they used energies that are simple quadratic energies, right? Pendulum and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And this seems to work quite well for neural networks, where the transfer function across the neuron is smooth bounded, etc., function. So what would happen if you try to apply this to a situation where forces are not smooth or forces are divergent, like in case of gravity and so on? Do you think that different approaches besides neural networks would be useful in that case?
Yes, definitely. You may actually need to put more knowledge in. So returning to the question, the central question of this workshop, my answer is you do need to put new physics in, but you get a choice in what physics you can put into your network versus not. So I see these Hamiltonian and Lagrangian biases as a very high level physical bias in that they work for almost any physics problem. There's a lot of people focused on putting in more domain specific physics biases, which they may work well for like a particular field, say condensed matter, but you're not going to care about it much, in cosmology or elsewhere. So that's like the more general answer. And then more specifically in response to like diverging fields and such, actually that's one of the most challenging things in physics is functions that are not smooth. So you think about collisions, right? Like a collision is actually one of the weirder and more difficult, I guess, things to understand in physics because there's this like huge discontinuity. So I guess I wouldn't say that's an easy problem. We've been sort of working on learning collisions with neural networks, and things get really messy right around that collision. I think what you need is like a very strong generalization to the function, which is almost exact in the limit, because, well, if you take a limit with a neural network, it always diverges weirdly. So like basically neural networks do very badly on limits. And, that's like what happens during a collision or like, when you're working with a gravitational field or something. So yeah, that's just really hard for neural networks.
Okay. I'm going to ask one last question, which is many people are asking, how would you build something like this for quantum mechanical systems, where especially the quantities that you measure are not the quantities which are the part of the dynamics, right? You're measuring amplitudes, you're measuring probabilities, but you're measuring probabilities, but it's the amplitude that is a dynamical variable that you are studying.
Yeah, this is something I've thought a little bit about. I just took a couple classes in undergrad on quantum mechanics, so I would love to hear from other people who have spent their lives thinking about these questions. My intuition is that you have to switch to a probabilistic model which sort of then captures the whole spectrum of the wave function. And then you have to sample from it. And then you sort of like the target of your sampling process will be like, in some sense, like the data set. The data set is like assumed to be drawn from an underlying like distribution, which is like this probability distribution of like all the paths that the model could have taken through your like through space.
Okay, well, thank you, Sam. Thank you very much. And there's way too many questions that have been asked. We could not ask. I could not relay all of them to you, but hopefully we'll get back to them in the last 15 minutes of the workshop. And now the next speaker is Max Tegmark from MIT. Max, it's all yours.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Can you see my screen all right? Yes, no? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Yes.
Great. So the central question here we were asked by Ilya is, can machine learning discover new physics not put in by hand? And I'm an optimist, so I'm going to answer yes, and give some examples related to symbolic, regression, and pregression. So what is symbolic regression, first of all? It's simply when you're given a table of numbers, data or from a simulation, and try to find a formula a symbolic formula that lets you calculate the last column from the other columns. This is a famous problem that Johannes Kepler spent 4 years on when he was staring at data like this from Mars until he discovered that it moves in an ellipse. And it's suspected to be NP hard because there are just exponentially many symbolic expressions. So if you're going to try them all until you find the right one, then it would take longer than the age of our universe even to discover the Planck black body spectrum. Now, the state of the art of this field is that for 11 years now, we've had this really awesome Eureka algorithm, which has been the best in the field. And there's also been a lot of genetic algorithms, but the field has been kind of criticized for lacking benchmarks where you could really determine in a quantitative way which methods worked best. So we've tried to help with this by creating the following benchmark, the Feynman Symbolic Regression Database, which you can go download online, all 6 GB of it. We took the 100 most famous or complicated physics equations from the Feynman lectures and made data tables for them. And interestingly, this Eureka package, just state of the art, it was able to solve 71% of them, which is pretty good. But when we took even harder equations from other textbooks, performance dropped to only 3 out of 20 here. So there's clearly value in doing even better. This is what I'm going to spend the rest of this talk on. We submitted a paper, we published a paper in Science Advances just last month where we were able to actually solve 100 out of the 100 equations and 18 out of the 20 harder ones. And here is what my students look like pre-lockdown on the top and post-lockdown on the bottom when they're locked into little rectangles like this. I'm going to tell you about 3 different papers and projects we've done where we've taken a bunch of ideas, mainly from physics, to try to improve where we are. One is graph modularity. What do I mean by that? I basically mean Julius Caesar's idea, divide and conquer. If you have a mystery table and you want to know what the function is, train a neural network first to approximate it, and then study that network to see if you can discover simplifying properties that let you break this one hard problem into simpler problems. And the reason this works is because typical physics functions, you can always write them as a graph like this. They tend to be quite modular. And if you can discover that modularity before knowing what the function is, you can chip off one piece at a time. For example, suppose you have data just implementing Newton's fourth law here, with a lot of variables. We first do automatic dimensional analysis, and then it simplifies down to the lower right side here. And then the neural network discovers, hey, wait a minute, it doesn't depend on these variables E and F in some arbitrary way, but only depends on them through their difference. So it just replaces 2 columns in the table by the difference between them. Then it recursively calls itself and does the same again and discovers another translational symmetry. So it can eliminate C and D, and then keeps going. And now it discovers, oh, there's another modularity here. This is actually multiplicatively separable. This function is now just a product of a function of some of the variables times something that depends on the other variables. And eventually it gets so simple that it can solve it with brute force or polynomial fitting. And the good news is that's what the new paper is that we've just finished now this week, which is coming on the archive next week. There are many more kinds of graph modularity you can also explore. Here are some examples. And this let us solve even more complicated equations like the ones you see here, where the neural network will basically discover that, hey, maybe even though there are all these input variables, you can combine them together, break things apart, and then divide and conquer, gradually get at the whole thing. Another idea that we got a lot of mileage of from physics is Occam's razor. The idea that if there are many solutions to a problem, the simpler one is usually the one we're more interested in. Ray Solomonoff gave this very rigorous definition of how complex something is. It's unfortunately NP hard and too hard to be useful in practice. Occam's razor, on the other hand, we got really far with that principle, even though it's so vague, it doesn't even have a formula. So we figured maybe we can do a compromise and write down something which is a crude approximation of complexity theory that's still fast enough to evaluate that we can build on it. And that's actually worked quite well. So for any formula or any data set, we can compute how complicated it is in bits and try to minimize that. And we actually get this way a more robust solution usually than otherwise. For example, on the right side here, when you're just fitting to a black body spectrum, I put in 3 dirty data points that are off. If you do least squares fitting, it's going to give a fit that sort of averages between the good and the bad data. If you use this information theory based one, it just learns to completely ignore all the bad data and goes right through the good data. And the information theory also lets us plot these nice trade-offs for the formulas themselves between how complicated the formulas are and how accurate they are. It's really cool to see that if you look at convex corners of this, formulas where you can't make it more accurate without also making it more complicated, it pulls out not only the exact formula here, in this case, relativistic kinetic energy in the lower right corner, but also mv squared over 2, which is the one other formula that we physicists find useful. So it's tapping into some of the intuition I think we use in physics. Andrew Tan, you gave him a shout out earlier there, David. He's part of this, great to work with. He had the idea to use normalizing flows so that we could apply regression also to data sets where we only had samples from some unknown probability distribution. So we do the flow first, and now we can actually evaluate our model density for the probability everywhere, and then run this AI Feynman package to solve the full probability distribution. Last but not least, I feel that all of this was quite nice. We were happy about it. It did feel quite a bit like cheating to me. And let me explain why. This is another paper we just posted on the archive the other week with Silvio Adriano-Drescu. You know, we, like Schmidt and Lipson and most others, would put in X and Y coordinates or something like that by hand, right? But if this is really going to be like a physicist, wouldn't it be nice if we could just give it raw video and it would figure out what the degrees of freedom are? This is also a call we heard from many of the other speakers this morning. And we wanted to have absolutely no hints whatsoever put in by the human. This is actually a lot harder than you might think. It sounds very trivial if you just have a video that have it figure out the X and Y coordinates, but what if it's not the X and Y coordinates? What if it's some completely different parameters it's supposed to learn, right? In fact, since we did not put in any bias like that, our method, if it works, has to equally well solve the same problems looked at through a strangely distorting lens, for example. So we built an architecture where it's trying to do is find a latent space so that the laws of physics just become as simple as possible in the latent space. I already talked about some aspects of what we mean by simple, which is really the essence and the core idea of this project. And we stole some ideas here from another famous physicist, Einstein. So he said that you can quantify how simple a space is by measuring the curvature in it. So you can look at the mapping of the latent space into the next time frame and see, can you minimize the curvature of that mapping? Just as we did with the other complexity stuff, we found a simpler way of approximating this, so we didn't have to calculate all those derivatives that go into the Einstein field equations. That still works remarkably well. We had 5 different kinds of videos with gravity, magnetic fields, a nonlinear quartic oscillator, etc. And in every single case, it figured out, without us telling it, that it was supposed to ignore those palm trees, the ocean, everything, and measure the X and Y coordinate of the rocket, removing any distortion. And in the end, our symbolic regression was even able to discover the exact equations of motion in every case. This took us longer than we thought. There were a lot of snags we hit. In the beginning, for example, the latent space would not recover an inertial frame. It looked like the lines of motion would often get entangled, like into this picture, looking like a cat somewhat here. We later realized that's because of knot theory. And by using some intuition from that, we were able to solve the problem, as you can read about later or ask me about. And in the end, by doing many different experiments, it was even able to find the unified latent space for all of them, which recovered precisely the inertial frames of relativity without even having any affine shears or anything like that that's unphysical. So in summary, I am quite optimistic that yes, we will be able to discover laws of physics that we don't put in by hand, because we already have rediscovered them long after Feynman and others did. And it's going to be really exciting in the future to see if we can actually discover new equations of physics for the first time, either exact ones or useful approximations to our experiments or from simulations. And I would like to end with an invitation for collaboration to anyone who's listening to this. If you have some cool data set that you would love to try this on, please let us know. Let's talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Thank you. And the questions are already coming in. So Sam, why don't you start with a question?
Well, first off, Max, love it. And actually, it's cool to see you citing the Lipson paper I think you started out with, because that was one of my big inspirations as well. It's just sort of a dumb question. Like Bayesian statistics says there's always some priors to your model. And at some point you were talking about how your approach is more or less tabula rasa. So I guess, like, are there not always some priors that you're bringing to the table?
Absolutely, there are. So let's be very clear on what they are. So in symbolic regression, first of all, when you're just given a table of numbers and you try to write it as a symbolic expression, the main prior you put in is you decide what are the basis functions that are considered elementary that it's allowed to use as building blocks. Do you just allow plus, minus, times, and divided by? Do you allow square roots, cosines, hyperbolic trigs, whatever, right? Ideally, you can try a series of different ones, but that is a choice. In the second case here, where you do pregression, we're calling it that just because it's the pre-regression step. There, we absolutely need some sort of prior to quantify some sort of measure of what we mean by simple, right? What we mean by simple time evolution in the step before we actually have equations. So if I just go back really quickly to the slide here with Einstein on it, saying that curvature is something you care about is of course a prior, but nature sort of cares about it. So it doesn't feel so ad hoc if you're doing physics. And we realized that actually something much simpler we could do is you can take if you take the mapping, the Jacobian times its transpose, that's the curvature you sort of induce on the new space. If the Jacobian itself just is constant and doesn't have any derivative, then you can see that this Christoffel symbol is 0 and the Riemann tensor is 0, all the curvature goes away. So we found that actually just putting a little penalty on a changing Jacobian, it depends on parameters, already was enough of a prior to get everything sorted out. And I think ultimately, the final arbiter is, can you find in the end a really simple solution, or can't you, regardless of how you got there? It's well known in complexity theory that you can only define complexity ever up to some prior about, you know, your language or compiler or whatever. But we've gotten far enough in physics without fully, you know, sorting that out, that I'm confident we can make a lot of progress with automating it too.
Cool. Thanks, Max. I just wanted to mention that like L2 regularization is often you can look at that as a prior over curvature as well. So the curvature prior seems pretty natural.
Thanks. Yeah.
There's a whole series of questions here from multiple people, from Nathan Simpson, Tartak Chandra, and John Vastola, and others that are all about more or less the same question, right? These methods are great test cases because you know the answer ahead of time, but will this work on messy real world data where data is only approximately described by nice equations, such as, for example, a video of a sand grain flying, right? You know, in some sense, this is adding this from myself, our beautiful theories are, we call them theories because what we really call sort of beautiful physical theories are the things that explain maybe 90% of data with 10% complexity, but they actually do not explain all of the intricate details in the data that we observe. We want to throw away the details, right? We want to normalize our data. So how would your method deal with that, with noisy data where some extra features are not actually explainable by simple theory?
I think that's a great question, and I've become more optimistic about this over time. One might say, of course, if you want to be the devil's advocate, that, oh, you know, this only works for like clean physics where you have exact formulas. But honestly, right, there's been a big shift in mindset in physics, as we heard about from Bryan, no, from Sam Greydanus. And nowadays, almost all physicists believe that every single formula we have in physics is just an approximation anyway of some more fundamental theory that we don't yet have. And what's so nice about taking this information theory based view, right, where you are actually not necessarily looking for the most accurate formula, but something which is pretty optimal, very simple and fairly accurate. You know, mv squared over 2 that you see here, we know that's not the exact formula because Einstein showed us there's a better one, but it's still really useful. And I think in the exact same sense, we should expect that even in more messy scientific areas with noise and where we don't expect anything exact, that we can find just really useful scaling laws, really useful approximations, both to experiments and also to simulations that take very long time to run. I think that we will often discover that, hey, there's an approximation that runs 1 million times faster that is super accurate. And I think that's useful science.
And so I actually read your papers before your talk. And so, for example, to discover the Newtonian gravity, your algorithm had to use about 1 million data samples, give or take. I forget the actual number. Newton had apocryphally sort of just 1 apple, right? So why such a big discrepancy?
Because that was the paper we published in April. The new one actually is where we add in the robustness that comes with this information theory stuff. Needs only about 100 data points for this, and actually, I'm very happy about that. The original one was very flimsy. I think generally this description length formalism is a really powerful tool. I think is going to be useful more widely also in machine learning, just to robustify things.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Max. It was a great talk. We're now at 11:11, so we're past our first session time. So we're going to now adjourn for 15 minutes, give everybody a break, and we'll all be back at 11:25 with, I think it's Bryan Daniels is the next talk. Thank you, Max.
Thank you.
Okay, we're back. It's 11:25, and so our next talk is, first of all, welcome back to the second session, and our next talk is Bryan Daniels from Arizona State University. Bryan, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks. All right. Thanks, Ilya, and thanks for organizing this. It's really exciting to see this field really starting to take off. So I'm going to be talking about what I'm going to call inferring logic, or as one of the participants said in the registration, asked this question: how can we obtain interpretability in machine learning when it's applied to science? And I think that perfectly sums up what it is we're trying to do. Let's try to do it. So let's try to learn physics using machine learning. How does this work? And actually, many other people have already used this example, so that's nice. It's a kind of benchmark example. Can we learn the laws of planetary motion if we're given the data from, say, here I'm using the distance of some planet over time. So measurements of if I start with a planet at some r0 away from the sun, and then I'm given the distances later at some time, how many of these observations do I need before I can infer a dynamical model of this of these dynamics? And notes that, so right, we can't just use some kind of curve fitting procedure, because there are two different types of curves. You can have planets that, you can have say comets that go out to infinity along a hyperbola, or you can have ellipses. So to get both of these behaviors, we really need to write down a dynamical model in terms of, say, differential equations. What do we want? We stipulate we want them in the form of these differential equations, and we want this model that's as simple as possible. And the hard part here really is that we want results even if we haven't measured all the important dynamical variables. So really, this is a two-dimensional problem. I have positions and velocities that I have to keep track of. But what if I'm only given the positions? And so our approach has been to not to search through the space of all possible models, but to actually define a lower dimensional hierarchy of models that we search through. And so the important part here is that we define the hierarchy in such a way that eventually we can fit any dynamics. And you can imagine various forms of these hierarchies. So I'm showing two examples here, one sort of power law form, and one a kind of saturating form that might be more useful in, say, biophysics. But basically, we're just adding more and more hidden variables, hidden dynamical variables, and more parameters to these models. And we stop when we can fit the data well enough. And so what do we get? So here's the true model on the left, so this two-dimensional dynamics, and we get this fit model where we didn't tell it that it was a two-dimensional problem, but that comes out of the approach. So we get some hidden variable x2. And you can see that the fit model does very well in comparison to the true model, even on, say, out of sample data. And my big selling point here was going to be that we can do it with so little data. So here we did it with 150 data points. And apparently Max's group is also doing this recently. So anyways, it's nice to have some competition here finally. So this is what we get out. Now, clearly the equations that we have don't look very nice in some sense. They're not as simple as we might want them to be, but we can still think about some simpler representations of this model. And so, and this is what I'm trying to say when I say I want to understand the logic of the model. I don't just want the dynamics, but I want to understand some intuitive have some intuitive way of understanding what the system is doing. And what's nice is that this approach still does match in some logical way. And so here what I'm doing is plotting in phase space. So right, I get these 2 dimensions. The algorithm is telling us that we need these 2 dimensions. And the trajectories are here in blue. But also if I look at, say, the null clines plotted here in green, or the unstable attractor, sorry, in green there. Actually, in this phase space, the 2 models look very similar. And so it's the same kind of dynamical logic, in a sense, that is captured by this model. And so what does it mean? So stepping back here, what does it mean? What do we really want to do if we're, say, learning new physics? And I'm just going to say some things that should be obvious, but helps me to sort of think about the problem. And actually, Max already had an example of this exact plot. So basically, as we're, say, learning, as I was learning new physics, say, in college, basically, I was finding that I can get more and more accurate actually what I thought physics was as a college student. But then you get into grad school and you realize there are other ways of doing physics. You start learning things like perturbation theory, you're taking theories in various limits, you're learning renormalization, and you're seeing that, as Ilya already pointed out, really what we're after is a model that can, say, get 90% right with 10% of the effort, something like this. Right, and in grad school, it's sort of the extreme, sort of everything turns into a Gaussian integral, right? Everything becomes very simple at some level because we can't solve these very complicated models in any other way. We have to make them very simple. And so, of course, I think machine learning is sort of the same, in the same boat. If you're just looking at machine learning and just aiming for maximum accuracy, you're just going to this bottom corner where things get very difficult. But really what we're aiming at for science and getting to this, what I'm calling logic or human intuition, you have to make things more simple. And so really going out on a limb here, right, we're supposed to be provocative in these talks. So I'll talk about philosophy, which I don't know a lot about, but thankfully Sam already brought this up. And I didn't realize that Niels Bohr had already made the statement. So basically that physics is not really a set of all truths about nature, that it's a restricted set. It's the set of all parsimonious truths about nature. It's things that we can understand. And to be really provocative and hopefully start some conversation, I mean, I really do believe that physics, it becomes fundamentally connected to cognition. And so, you know, at some point, physics starts to look like, say, cognitive science, but we can argue about that later. So anyway, so where are we? So robot scientists at the moment, I think, are sitting down here in this realm where they can be very accurate, but they're not so easy to interpret. And so essentially, we are defining the conceptual question, and we use machine learning to run the test and whether that's true. And so to give you an example, what we've been able to do recently is apply this really to real data, in this case, a biological question. And so the human question that we have here that we have to specify is that something like this. So say, do animal behaviors correspond to separate dynamical attractors? Say this C. elegans, when we watch it, it seems like it has sort of a forward state where it's moving forward, and then a backward state or a pause state. And maybe these correspond to different attractors. And then what machine learning is very good at, right, is testing lots of possible hypotheses. And so essentially, and because we built it in, it can spit it out in sort of a simple language that we can understand. So using our algorithm, we were able to feed it with this escape behavior data, and it spit out these two differential equations. So we just gave it velocity data, and it said that there's actually a hidden variable here, maybe corresponding to some kind of memory in the worm. And then we can use that to answer our question: do animal behaviors correspond to separate dynamical attractors, which is in this high-level language of dynamical systems. And just to give you the punchline, we find that we don't have to describe these in terms of separate attractors, that we can get that actually the best model that comes out here so sort of has a gradation between different types of behavior. And so what does this mean for the future? You know, essentially, we want to send our robot scientists to grad school, right? And so we need to give them tools to make things simpler. And so a lot of this is already built in, right? We already have these ideas of sparsity or regularization, model selection, but I think more can be done. And right, in terms of things like Max was saying, a sort of library of logical structures to test. Right, and we had examples of you know, building in symmetries, like looking explicitly for conservation laws, including types of coordinate transformations that might make the problem simpler. And so we've seen a lot of this already, which I think is very exciting. And one thing I want to mention here is that I think will be useful, although Sam claims that taking limits in neural networks is hard. I think that's true, but I think it's maybe important. And I think, right, so I talked about analyzing things in terms of, say, bifurcations, essentially taking time to infinity and seeing what happens. We can also take n to infinity to define things like phase transitions. And already we have tools like this manifold boundary approximation method, where we can look along manifolds in model space and look for limits where parameters become more simple. And so to sum up, you know, one of the questions someone had asked and preliminarily was, you know, when do we know that we're ready to apply this to real data? Well, it's already happening. The machine learning as a scientific tool is already here. We're already applying it to real data. And the continuing challenge here is really to go beyond just accuracy, of course, and teach machines to do this hard work of finding logical and intuitive approximations. So thanks to my collaborators, and I'll mention that our software is on GitHub, and we'd love to have people download it and try it out and contribute. So thanks.
Thank you, Brian. So we already have a couple of questions. So let's start with those. What if the data was given in terms of distance from the Earth? Would you be able to learn the heliocentric view and the correct equation? That's presumably about the planets moving around the sun.
Right.
This is from Tartak Chandra.
Yeah, great question. We haven't tried it yet. My intuition is that it would still find you know, a predictive model, but probably not in the form that you want, right? In the sort of simplest form. And so this is where I think we're going to need these additional tools to say, you know, have transformations that work on an existing predictive model to make it more simple. Yeah.
Okay. Now we have a big picture question from John Vastola. He writes, I love the provocative big picture stuff. Imagine someone runs an incredibly detailed quantum or otherwise simulation of a large number of molecules. In your view, does this only count as physics if we can extract something simple from it? Obviously, a large array of numbers is meaningless to us in some sense without interpretation, reduction, and simplification.
Yes, that's exactly my point. Yeah. And this becomes important in other realms too, beyond physics. I mean, you know, if we're trying to understand neuroscience or any kind of biological problem too, we're already starting to see very detailed models that can be predictive, but they don't give us a lot of intuition. And I think where physicists can be useful is to provide these tools that can make things more interpretable.
I have a question. Okay. Love the provocative big picture stuff as well. And I wanted to push a little bit on your claim that physics on some level becomes fundamentally about human cognition.
Yeah, well,
so I was actually trying to, it says, okay, I think from your slide, it says physics becomes fundamentally connected to cognition. Okay, so maybe not the human part.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Right. So I want to push back against that because that was sort of, I was arguing the opposite in my presentation. I think we've gone that route, but I think the Greeks and to some extent Newton and earlier physicists saw there as being absolute truth to the universe. So I was wondering, like, what constraints does this notion of physics as being cognition impose upon us, and should we accept those constraints as true?
Yeah, yeah. I think this is it's a philosophical point. So really, I think I don't have, I'm not the authority here, but I would say, there are things about the world that we can't know, and that's okay. But we're just looking for the things that we do know. I mean, your quote from Niels Bohr, he says this. We're looking for the things that we can understand, and I think that is what makes science different from just machine learning or trying.
But isn't that assumption that we can't understand things unhealthy? Like, what if we just thought, oh, we can't understand these corrections to the way light bounces off metals, and just kind of left it at that?
Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, no. I mean, I'm not saying that we should give up, but that this is intrinsic to the whole thing, that we're looking for simple representations. And so you just have to keep looking for simple representations. There's no guaranteed sort of there's no free lunch, right? There's no guaranteed algorithm that will give you the right answer, but we can keep looking. Yeah.
In some sense, if I look at that's outside world, I mean, Newtonian mechanics, we clearly understand it, right? It's great, we know it, right? And when you build a bridge, you really need to work really, really, really hard, and sort of looking at this bridge and figuring out how the different trusses and everything works. It's not an easy thing. We need to do large-scale simulations, and I think that this is what we are trying, in some sense, to get to, is to get a theory, to get an understanding which allows us, with relatively little effort, understand the 90% of what's going on, but also gives us a framework for how to make the next 9% and the next 0.9%, right? If you just keep on putting more and more effort, and it becomes progressively harder, exponentially harder to get that last significant digit. I mean, that's the goal. And maybe that's impossible. I would hope that it is possible, but just because otherwise I'm in the wrong business. It's sort of a very self-centered point of view, but I want it to be possible because I want to be the one, helping to understand, to discover the theories. But fundamentally, we won't know till we get there, or till we don't, right?
Yeah, I agree.
There is one more question. So how would we incorporate symmetries and constraints, let's say energy conservation, like what Sam did in his talk, into your approach?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And my guess is that it will look something like, so we had, we started with these different, right, so here are two different sort of classes of models that we can use. And actually one of them worked better in the planetary motion example, and the other one worked better in the biophysical case. And my guess is that you would have to build it in at this sort of level where you have a model class where there is something that's conserved, and then you can test whether that sort of model works better than something that doesn't conserve that quality. Yeah, but I think it's a great future way to go.
But then that means that we're putting in by hand. Right?
Yes, but yeah, I'm fine with that. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bryan. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for your talk. And now we're going to switch to Andrea Liu from University of Pennsylvania. Andrea, it's your screen now.
Forgot to unmute myself there. Okay. Okay. Everybody can see that now? Okay, so I'm going to, in contrast to the last few talks, I'm going to talk about problems where you have many, many, many degrees of freedom. And so as a condensed matter physicist, right, my purpose in life is really to try to understand macroscopic or collective phenomena that emerge in many body systems from microscopic properties. And if you think about that, right, what that requires is statistical mechanics, right, where you take microstate information, really microscopic information, you distill it down to understanding things about the properties of distributions of the relevant microscopic quantities for the problem that you're interested in. And statistical mechanics has been hugely successful in helping us do that, both to solve this dimensional reduction problem, okay, of taking all that microstate information and just reducing it to relevant distributions, and also finding the right microscopic quantities that give us the insight into the connection between the microscopic and the macroscopic physics. So the particular, I'm going to focus on what we can learn about a particular problem, and that's the glass transition. It's a transition that we've been making use of for thousands of years, but actually don't understand that well. So the idea is if you take any liquid and you cool it down fast enough so that it can't crystallize, the particles remain in a disordered configuration so that if you looked at a snapshot, it looks like a liquid. And as you lower the temperature, the relaxation time just rises continuously. And very rapidly, it can increase by 10 orders of magnitude in just tens of degrees. And at some point, it just passes out of your window of time to reach to equilibrate, and you give up and you call it a glass. So this is a system which, once it becomes a glass, right, is inherently out of equilibrium. You have not waited long enough for it to reach equilibrium. And this is, you know, one of many systems where statistical mechanics has failed us. And it's, in this case, there are two complications. First of all, it's far from equilibrium, and it lacks, you know, nice things like crystal symmetries. It's disordered. We've done a bunch of work looking at this problem using machine learning, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. So first of all, so we're trying to understand a collective phenomenon. What collective phenomenon are we trying to understand? In this case, what we would like to understand is how does that relaxation time increase with temperature? What is that functional form? So different glass formers have different functional forms. And the most naive thing you would say is it should be what's called Arrhenius. In other words, the time to reach equilibrium should just be governed by a well-defined energy barrier. So just given by a Boltzmann factor. So it should just goes like exponentially in the energy barrier divided by temperature. Okay. And there are some glasses, things like silica, that are nearly Arrhenius. Okay. But there are others that are very far from that. So they can be strongly super Arrhenius, as if the energy barrier is getting higher and higher as you lower the temperature. And others are what are called sub-Arrhenius, so they grow more slowly, so that the energy barrier seems to become lower as you cool down. So as I said, we're trying to understand then that relaxation time is a function of temperature. And the reason why, you know, this, as I said, it's a problem that resists statistical mechanics. And the reason why you might want to turn to machine learning is because that's what it's designed to do, is one of the missions of statistical mechanics, which is that dimensional reduction. That's, you know, that's what it's really good at. But that leaves us with this question: if we want to understand the relaxation time, what's the right microscopic variable to focus on, to get intuition about that, to learn about that. Okay, and that's a physics question. We decide to focus on finding a static structural variable, something that you could get just by looking at snapshots of the system to understand that's correlated with glassy dynamics. And what do I mean by that? The way a system reaches equilibrium, for example, a liquid, if you put a stress on it, for example, or you change the temperature, the way it reaches equilibrium is the particles rearrange relative to each other. And in a liquid, any particle can rearrange at any time, right? But in solids, that's really not true. In crystals, we know that particles that are defects, like dislocations and grain boundaries, are much, much more likely to rearrange due to thermal fluctuations. So the question becomes, suppose I'm in a glassy liquid that's above the glass transition, okay? I can still equilibrate, okay? But are there defects like the ones that you see in crystals? In other words, are certain particles much more likely to rearrange than others? And you can ask the same question in the glass. And that's been actually a more than 50-year challenge in the field to identify these kind of defects, because of course the system is disordered, so everything is a defect in some sense, in the crystal sense, right? But are there special particles that are much more likely to rearrange? And this is where machine learning comes in, that yeah, people have tried for many, many years to find such defects, and it turns out to be really easy using machine learning. So what's the idea? So what we do is we look at the local structural environment around each particle, and we characterize it by asking how many particles have their centers at a distance r away from this, okay, per unit volume, okay, and that's gonna, you know, this is on average, it looks something like this, there are these bumps, okay, in it, and but each particle has a different structural environment, so it's different for each particle. And then what we want to do is define a quantity, which you call softness, S of I, for each particle I, okay, which is a weighted integral of its local pair correlation function, where we infer the weights. This weighting function is the same for every single particle, and it is chosen so that this quantity that we end up with, this softness, is most strongly correlated with rearrangements. And you can do this in various ways. We initially did it with a support vector machine. Now we use linear regression, but this is the idea, okay? And it does work, that in the end, we find out that if you look at, so we have this variable which is positive when it's more likely to rearrange, negative when it's less likely to rearrange. So the more positive it is, the more likely it is to rearrange. And we find that 90% of the rearranging particles have a softness that's greater than 0. Okay, great. So, you know, and we did find these things with machine learning. That's great. It predicts rearrangements, but that doesn't help me with my goal as a condensed matter physicist, right? To learn something about a collective property. So for that, we have to go further. And what we do is we look at what is the probability that a particle which has a given softness is going to rearrange. So this is just a fraction at any moment that are undergoing, particles of given softness that are undergoing rearrangements. And the remarkable thing is that if you look at this probability of rearranging, it is Arrhenius. In other words, if I look at particles of a given softness, there is a well-defined energy barrier for rearranging, okay? And on the whole, there is not, for the whole system, the relaxation time is not characterized by a single barrier, because there are different barriers for particles of different softness, and that's what it looks like here. So the particles of higher softness have lower barriers, they're more likely to rearrange, right? Where particles of lower softness have higher energy barriers to rearrange. So there is this well-defined barrier, and that's really the key. That's saying that softness is a useful microscopic quantity that really simplifies the dynamics, so I can think about particles of given softness as having a given energy barrier. The nice thing is that this works. We see this Arrhenius dependence of the probability of rearranging, not only for the initial system we looked at, which was a mixture of Leonard-Jones particles, okay, but also for our model of silica, which, so the Leonard-Jones system is strongly superareneous. So it's as if the energy barrier increases very rapidly as you lower the temperature. Whereas silica has an energy barrier that doesn't change all that much as you change the temperature. And yet the probability of rearranging is still areneous. Here's another system. This is a system that's actually been used to look at cells and epithelial tissues. It has subareneous behavior. So it increases more slowly than areneous. And again, the probability of rearranging is areneous. And the same thing, we see the same thing even in polycrystals, where the particles that rearrange are in grain boundaries. Again, the probability of rearranging is areneous in temperature. So softness is telling us the energy barrier across the whole spectrum of order to disorder, from polycrystals to classes, and also from sub to areneous to superareneous behavior. So what do we get out of it? It turns out that if you make a simple assumption that the relaxation time is just 1 over the probability of rearranging evaluated at the average softness at a given temperature, okay, that actually predicts the relaxation time. It does that in the Leonard-Jones. I'm not going to go into this plot and explain it, but it does predict it for the Leonard-Jones system. It works for silica, okay, and it works also for the vertex model, which shows subareneous behavior. So it does seem to work, at least for these cases, across the spectrum from sub to superareneous behavior. So, as I said, okay, data science methods like machine learning really are designed for dimensional reduction. So they are a very natural approach for trying to do statistical mechanics, trying to understand collective phenomena in many body systems. But choosing which data science approach to use, which particular machine learning approach to use, really requires physical insight. And then identifying which are the right microscopic variables to look at also requires physical insight. But if you do that, I think machine learning can be an incredibly valuable tool in learning about these collective phenomena. Okay, so just want to thank the people who have done this work and take some questions.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. Well, the questions are coming in. I'm going to start. So the first question I have is sort of, yes, you've shown us that there is this beautiful quantity softness that allows us to predict arrangement, predict relaxation in these systems, but how do I interpret it, right? I mean, how do I measure this quantity in an actual system? How does it relate to the things that I can actually measure, touch, right? Understand?
Yes. So in fact, let me see if I can find this slide. In fact, it is, because we define it in terms of the local pair correlation function, we can easily measure it in an experiment. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah. All right. Oh, yeah. I got to unskip the slide. So just from video microscopy images, we've been actually able, with our many experimental collaborators, to apply this to a range of experimental systems, from colloids to granular packings. So in the end, what you learn is these weights, okay, that weight the pair correlation function. And what you find is that they are high at the peaks and valleys of the correlation function. In other words, where the pair correlation is high at the first peak, and at the first valley, and the next peak, and the next valley, that's where the weights are the biggest, okay? And what that's saying is, what matters is how many neighbors do you have in the first neighbor shell around you? How many are you missing in the gap between the first neighbor shell and the second neighbor shell, which is that second peak? Okay, and this goes back to a very old idea, actually, in the glass transition literature, the idea that each particle is caged by its neighbors. And so softness is picking up on slight differences in the structural environment so that some cages are weaker, some particles have weaker cages than others. Okay, so fewer neighbors in that first neighbor shell. And that's what that weighting function is picking up and exaggerating, okay, to get this strong correlation.
Okay.
So that's the nice thing, by the way, of using the support vector machine or linear regression, is that you can gain insight afterwards into what physical quantity is softness. And we also use deep learning. We also use, all kinds of other machine learning methods. It turns out that we can never beat about 90% cross-validation accuracy. And so we used the simplest one that allowed us to get that physical insight.
So continuing on this, as you mentioned, there are multiple different methods that you have used. What is common among those that have worked and those that maybe have not, right? Coming back to the main question of this workshop, what did you have to put in order to make sure, in order to actually achieve a working solution?
So it turns out that everything we've tried has basically worked. And what we put in, right, is a training set. So the key is to choose the right training set. How do you train this? So you train this to learn, you show what particles that are rearranging and particles, it turns out it's very useful to show particles that have not rearranged for a long time in this case. And so as long as you choose your training set properly, it doesn't actually matter too much what machine learning method you use, and we get about the same thing. We actually have also used unsupervised learning, but it's not as predictive. It doesn't do as well.
Okay. So a question from John Vastola. After identifying softness as a key degree of freedom, is it obvious that it's the right choice for these glasses in the hindsight? Is the physical intuition is clear now that it has been identified?
Yeah, I think so. So I think, first of all, this idea of finding a structural order parameter that goes along with the relevant dynamics, right? Particle rearrangements are what are needed in order for the system to equilibrate. You have to be able for particles to change their neighbors. That's the difference, of course, between a solid and a liquid. So once you understand that, then I think it is reasonable to say, okay, it's a structural quantity that correlates with that will be useful. And then the insight, as I said, that comes out that softer particles, the particles of higher softness, have lower numbers of first shell neighbors, therefore weaker cages, is actually in accord with what people have thought for a long time. This just provides a really nice way of quantifying it.
Okay, so question from Grace Zhang. Can one map softness to a simpler physical parameter in the limit of some transition point, e.g. the glass transition in glasses or some grain boundary pre-melting transition in polycrystals?
Yeah, so in certain cases, it does appear as if we might be able to map it into a simpler quantity. So we have some evidence that if you look at particles just with finite range interactions, so that if they overlap, they repel, and if they don't overlap, they don't interact at all, then at least in high dimensions, it appears, this is work by my graduate student, Sean Rideout, it appears that that softness basically reduces just to the number of overlapping neighbors you have. So that's really simple, okay? So that particles with fewer overlapping neighbors are more likely to rearrange. And, I think a very interesting question is, okay, so people have been able to solve that problem in infinite dimensions analytically. can we, where there is truly a glass transition, a sharp thermodynamic glass transition, and can we somehow make connection with that?
Okay. Another question is from Ted Brzezinski. Andrea, great talk. There's still a missing link to microscopic mechanics, a kinetic model of softness. Are there data science tool that you may help, that you think may help identify the link? What are the pitfalls?
Yeah, in fact, what we would like, so we have softness, which is defined on each particle. We can turn that into a field, so softness depending on position and time. And what we would really like to do is now develop, partial differential equations for how does softness evolve in position and time. Okay, so this is our ultimate goal. And this would then be, a starting point for understanding glassy dynamics. We're taking partial steps to this goal. And the first thing we're actually doing is just looking at the interplay of softness with dynamics and with elasticity, which also is important in these systems. So yeah, but that is our eventual rather ambitious goal here.
So one last question. So we're testing our own, this is from Laura Lee. So we're testing our own physical insight using machine learning algorithms as an empirical tool. Is there a way for machine learning to come up with physical insight without human intervention and identify those degrees of freedom?
I don't know. I have to say, I just don't know. In this case, we didn't know a priori that softness was going to tell us something about the strength of a cage around each particle, right? The machine learning did actually tell us that in the end, we could look at it and say, oh yes, okay, that makes sense, right? But we didn't put in that it was going to capture the strength of the cage. What we did was to characterize it in terms of the local pair correlation function, basically to make connection with liquid state theories. It's a very natural thing to do. Can you do this without any insight whatsoever? I really don't know. And in a way, I have to say, I don't even care. I am a physicist. I like to be able to do physics. I don't want to just turn it over to a machine to do everything for me. And, the machine is helping me to learn about the physics. That's great. We've been using computers that way for a long time, like for MD simulation or something like that, right? And this is yet another tool in our toolbox that we can use to learn physics.
Well, thank you. Thank you for a great talk. And I think now it's time to move to the next talk. Again, if you want to ask questions, we'll have the Q&A session at the very end. So the next speaker is Roger Melko from Waterloo and Perimeter Institute. Roger, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Ilya, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me and see my slides?
I can hear you and see your slide. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Ilya, and especially thanks to Tierra for getting everything together today for this workshop. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that we throw around in the kind of domain of quantum complexity and quantum many-body physics up at Waterloo. So I'm at the University of Waterloo and the Perimeter Institute, and together we run a sort of an AI lab. We call it the Perimeter Institute Quantum Intelligence Lab, pictured here in better times, pre-COVID. And just to echo some of the themes that I think I've heard throughout today's talks, one interesting thing that's come up is really how I think kind of standard off-the-shelf machine learning methods can learn physics concepts. That's kind of the first point. And a postdoc who works up with us at Perimeter Waterloo, Sebastian Wetzel taught me this in sort of a startling fashion very recently when he adapted what's called a Siamese or twin neural network. These were architectures used in the mid 90s. They came out of Bell Labs originally for comparing signatures. So to take two handwritten signatures and verify that somebody had signed a document. What Sebastian and collaborators did was sort of modify these what we now call twin neural networks to take data sets that maybe differ by some, let's say something like a Lorentz transformation, or they're related by some conserved quantity, and to really learn those conserved quantities. So if it's a Lorentz transformation and you feed in pairs of data, this thing will learn really the invariant, the space-time interval, and it can be used for other applications too. And it's just one example of the things that we're interested in. But I think it illustrates a couple interesting points. Number one, that machine learning is very kind of remarkably adept at doing physics like this. And also that there's sort of an interpretation step that we've been talking about a lot. So this idea of interpretation or explainability, which is very important for, I would argue, humans interfacing with these types of neural networks. So interpretability or explainability, if you're thinking about kind of XAI, is really an important part of not only our physics research, but also of machine learning research. And if we think about it, we've really developed a lot of these tools to do human-like tasks, for example, comparing signatures and so on. And you could think of all the human-like tasks that machines are trying to sort of emulate. I've circled the ones that are, modern machine learning is doing well at: computer vision, natural language processing, gameplay, the GANs that solve Pac-Man and things like that. And there's other things we're still hoping to, I guess, achieve with robotics and so on. But I'm pretty comfortable adding to this, finding physical laws, finding interpretable models, and kind of all the things that we've been talking about in this workshop. And so if I imagine starting, from what for me and for many of us is the theory of everything, this is kind of what I want to talk about, not discovering, but sort of leveraging. So just imagine that the group of us progresses enough that, we can take data from the Balmer series of hydrogen and somehow pull out, Schrodinger's equation, or pull out the concept of a Hamiltonian or something like that. I'm pretty optimistic that these, this type of machine learning will be something that we achieve. So, the kind of epitome of our modern quantum many-body physics now, I would say, the field that I work in, sort of a combination of condensed matter and quantum information, is really taking this, what I call microscopic laws, the things that we're interested in perhaps in learning, as a foundation of physics, and really enhancing them. And so this is kind of the idea of, increasing the accuracy in some sense of things that we know. So, I'm optimistic that we can discover something like this. And we already know that kind of the conventional computers that we have today can enhance things like Schrodinger's equation, so that we can take the orbitals of hydrogen, combine them in complex ways to say things about chemistry, solid state physics, materials properties, and so on. Okay. And actually, I just want to make another note that, machine learning is very promising in this field, and sort of leveraging, I guess, our microscopic or reductional knowledge of physics into, things that really transform technology and society. So I just want to highlight some work by Isaac Tamblin's group in Ottawa that really, leverages, things like deep neural networks to enhance things like density functional theory calculations, which can be used to predict, new materials properties and all this stuff that drives our technology. And so I would kind of, to expand on, maybe a theme that we've seen here. I think Bryan showed a very similar kind of one-dimensional plot or two-dimensional plot of ease versus accuracy. So I just want to show my list of human-like tasks, which are contained in this, yellow bubble here, and add to it things like I'm using the word reductionist for our laws. So, the idea of conservation and symmetries and things like this, I'm going to be provocative and call them reductionist. And, adding to complexity and in the sense that we want to calculate highly accurate properties of things like materials. This blue bubble here is really what computers are good at. So again, leveraging our knowledge of these laws to do things like calculate, properties of quantum chemistry, band structures, and so on. And so really, this is kind of how I envision sort of the current state of the field of human computer, I guess, collaboration, if you will. But one point that I want to make, which was also made in the last talk, is that not everything that we observe in nature fits readily into this paradigm. And so I'm talking about quantum many-body physics. And so in quantum many-body physics, even though we understand, the theory of everything for our everyday existence, if you will, in the Schrodinger equation, I'm not talking about black holes and, quarks and radiation. I'm talking about, things that we experience. Even with the help of, our best modern computers, there's still phenomena that we observe in nature that doesn't sort of fit this picture of bridging between fundamental concepts to observation. And the prototypical example is high temperature superconductivity. Okay, so high TC superconductivity is kind of this phenomena that we can't explain by building a bridge from that single particle Schrodinger equation. And there's other ones, including simulating quantum computer. If you really go down that rabbit hole, this is one thing we can't do with classical computers. And I would add to this the glass problem and things like protein folding, where all of these problems share features is that strong interactions are key. Strong interactions are really playing a key role in the fact that we can't go from some sort of single particle simple microscopic theories to explain the phenomena that we observe in nature. And so sometimes we call this phenomena emergent. And that emergence has to do with sort of the combinatorial or the computational complexity of taking, say, qubit states and coupling them all together. And if a qubit can be measured in a spin up or spin down, you get this kind of exponentially exploding cursive dimensionality, which kind of destroys this bridge that we're trying to make a connection. So I would add these phenomena that we observe to this side of sort of my diagram here. So I have things that humans are good at. This is easy. We're increasing accuracy, but even if we increase accuracy as much as modern computers can let us, there's still sort of a barrier here between what can be calculated and what can't be, or what can't be understood. And this is, formally you might say this is two different complexity classes, but polynomial versus exponential, something like that is sort of sufficient. And what I kind of provocatively want to propose is that if machine learning is really pushing this boundary in computer vision, natural language processing, gameplay, and discovering physical laws, this cursive dimensionality is actually shared between many of these tasks and these tasks out here. So my question is, can we make headway on the right-hand side of this diagram in the strongly correlated regime, with machine learning? And kind of the question that was posed, what do we have to feed into computers to learn this type of physics, or what do the machines need in terms of data? I would say the most interesting data that we now have access to is data from present day, I would say, quantum computers or quantum devices. So, we can produce projective measurements from, tens or soon hundreds of qubits. We can reconstruct quantum wave functions for these almost impossibly complex many-body systems. And we can compare measured quantities from these reconstructions to sort of what we were trying to design in the computer. And so using this approach, I think we can really build in the ideas of complexity into our machines. So machines trained from this data, can be used to ask questions about, what we're trying to prepare. Is it a high temperature superconductor emulation? It can also be used to help us improve our current quantum devices like we did here in this collaboration. And I would say we can study and try to interpret the complexity in being reflected in these neural networks to just really understand, the nature of these new phenomena and how they relate to the concept of complexity. So I'll end there. I think I'm out of time, and I just want to leave up this final slide and just emphasize, physics is driven by data. We have some of the most compelling data that we've ever had in history, sort of with the advent of near-term quantum computers. And the frontier of quantum physics is really in this blue, it's in this interface of what's, computationally complex, leveraged on our sort of microscopic knowledge, and what seems to lie outside of this human computer collaboration. And I believe this is one of the most promising areas for machine learning to sort of make contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. So do any of our speakers have questions before we move to the audience? Well, I mean, I'm gonna start with one question. So for this, I mean, you didn't show a lot of algebra here, but you showed some slides where you tried to represent sort of what it is that your approach is doing, which is using effectively RBM style models to model the quantum data, right? And for this to work on realistic amounts of data, we need to have these RBMs not just fully connected, but sparse. We should not become coupling too many variables together. And in some sense, the fact that this approaches with sparse RBM seem to work on your quantum data says us something about the nature of physical data, right? They should not have worked, or they should not necessarily have worked, but they do. And so what does it tell us, right? Why do they work? What do you think? Why do they work? And what does it tell us about the structure of the specific quantum systems that you are dealing with?
Right, so that's a good kind of, I think, paradigm for what we're trying to achieve in some sense. You reconstruct a quantum state, a quantum many-body state, and then you can ask questions. Here I illustrated the RBM, but I also want to emphasize that there's other generative modeling approaches to do this. And you might ask, in the end, can we interpret something about the wave function based on, say, for example, the sparsity of the data? And, we do have sort of, I would say, interpretable or explainable paradigms or interpretable paradigms about how that sparseness should look. So one thing I'll mention is the entanglement area law. We believe that wave functions are entangled in many body systems with something called an area law, which relates back to black hole information. And so in principle, we should be able to learn that, concept of sparsity when we look at what the weights and biases, or mostly the weights are in these types of architectures. But there may also be violations to those laws or things that are important. So this is actually particularly true in topological physics. So topological quantum computing, for example, or topological order, where we have corrections to those sort of paradigms of, interpretable paradigms that we could, hope to learn by looking at these devices. So again, we get back to that notion of interpretability, explainability. And I guess what we're implicitly believing somehow is that, our predictive power comes necessarily with this notion of interpretability, and that's what we're chasing. But we could also ask the question, I guess going back here, are there certain phenomena that just can't be interpreted? And I think that's something we probably don't all agree on, but there's definitely experimental evidence that there are, complex collective phenomena that we have yet to interpret.
So a question from Atisi Acharya. Can you comment on the scaling of the number of projective measurements, bases and samples needed for extracting the meaningful reconstructions?
Sure. So it depends on the structure of the wave function again. So it's hard to generally say how many bases and measurements are required. If the wave function is kind of an effective classical wave function where expanded in the computational basis, the signs of all, the amplitudes are all positive and real, so there's no sign structure. One basis is sufficient to reconstruct the entire wave function. When that assumption breaks down, things get more complicated, and it turns into this sort of tomography problem, where in the worst case scenario, you have an exponential number of bases and quite possibly a very large number of measurements or a high sample complexity. But we really don't know how to classify real world phenomena into that sort of spectrum of complexity. We don't know which phenomena correspond to, simple, low sample complexity, low number of bases, and which phenomena correspond to an exponential scaling. So it's a good question. It's really, I think, hits at the heart of what we're trying to do with this technology.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So, Roger, there's a sense in which the directions you're taking your research in terms of many body simulation resembles sort of more efficient sampling techniques that people are working on in reinforcement learning. Sort of, you refer to that as game playing. And in both cases, there's a huge value in sampling from regions that you don't understand well, or there's like an exploration bonus in that if you collect data correctly, you're more data efficient. So can you comment on like the value of going beyond supervised learning in your domain?
Right, so this is unsupervised learning because what we're doing is learning the underlying probability distribution, or what I'm calling a wave function. If you want to go,
that's like beyond data sets, I guess.
Right, so if you want to go beyond data sets, so if you think about reinforcement learning where data in principle costs you, I think that's a really interesting area of research, especially for issues of control in these quantum systems and so on. So if I have, qubits stabilized in an optical lattice, and I need to understand how to apply pulses to control that quantum computer, that's really a really interesting domain for reinforcement learning. One step higher up in the stack, if you want to think of it like that, in a quantum computer, reinforcement learning is also very relevant for things like error correction. So when you actively have to correct for cosmic rays hitting your qubits and in order to return them to their proper state, there the data is expensive. It takes a long time to gain for any for an instantaneous configuration of qubits, and so you want to minimize the data costs. And so I'd say anywhere where you don't have the luxury of obtaining data, whether it takes too much storage or too much time, that would be the domain for reinforcement learning.
So I'm actually not sure I agree with that, because reinforcement learning currently takes like several orders of magnitude more data than supervised learning or unsupervised learning.
Right. Well, just again, the question, if you want to look at the state of a qubit, you may only have imperfect knowledge of it, and you may only, be able to obtain the data within the time frame that thing's coherent for. I think that's all I mean by that.
Okay. Let's ask one more, probably the last question for this section. So Ahmed Roman is asking, could one say that locality is more important than the action, the distance, or entanglement in your examples?
It's a good question, right? So locality, if we think of sort of physical phenomena and local Hamiltonians and sort of, these fully connected networks where, let's call them, quantum species that are close to each other should have the strongest correlations. Though, the real space correlations, like the 2-point functions that were talked about by Andrea and so on, should be very important, and they should be reflected in the correlations in these machines. So locality, I think, is one of the most important concepts in physics that translates to probably the structure and interpretability of these machines. In terms of entanglement, I mean, in some sense, what we're doing in these machines, which are classical, is really mediating entanglement through the latent space. And so it gets a little more complex. If you have a qubit here and a qubit here that are in a singlet, obviously that's not real space locality. But in these machines, we can see that type of thing, I'd say, mediated through the latent space or the hidden units. So technically the concept, they'll look very different in principle, but I think we can also interpret the range of entanglement using these types of techniques. Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Roger, and thank you. And the next speaker, the last speaker for this workshop, is Lucy Colwell from Cambridge University. And Lucy, the floor is yours.
Great. Can you hear me, Ilya? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen and we can hear you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So thank you, everybody, for staying in the workshop this long. It's been really interesting so far. I'm tempted to say, and now for something completely different, because this is really a talk about, it's really focused on empirical data. So the question I'm very interested in, which is related to the question that Alex opened the whole workshop with, which is how we can use machine learning to help us build models for proteins, and in particular, how we can understand the relationship between sequence and phenotype, which underlies so many important questions in biology and health. And so I have this schematic here on my cover slide, which indicates the way in which I and many others think that machine learning can contribute to being able to explore these fitness landscapes by essentially being used in an active learning loop where we make sequence variants, synthesize and test them in the lab, and then use that data to build, update, and fine-tune models of the relationship between sequence or learned representations of sequence and functional activity that was measured in that experiment. And of course, once we have that model, which is in silico and so cheap to evaluate, we can rapidly carry out many evaluations in order to explore this landscape and find the optima in silico, and then test those optima that we found in the lab. And here I'm really interested in the ideas that were just mentioned in the questions just now about the trade-off between exploration and exploitation. Do we just take the values that the function we currently have, or the sequences that the function we currently have thinks are best, or do we try and explore, look at the areas where our learned model is uncertain, and try and improve the quality of the model? Really getting that balance right is important. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a very concrete example where we use simple and complex models to explore the sequence plasticity of viral capsids. So these viruses in general are trying to get past the immune system. They're trying to evade neutralizing antibodies. And I'm thinking about this in the context of gene therapy. And this is a adeno-associated virus-mediated gene therapy. So in this case, it's very important that these viral capsids can evade neutralizing antibodies. Otherwise, they're just going to get destroyed by the body and they won't be able to carry out the required function. So essentially, in order for AAV gene therapy to become more and more effective, we need to identify diverse new capsid proteins that can prevent attack by the host immune system, so they can evade those neutralizing antibodies. We can also address the cargo to the specific tissues or cell types. And so there's a little picture here of the structure of an AAV capsid. It's a very large object, it's about 25 nanometers across. And so we're interested in trying to redesign this capsid protein. If we think about this from a physics perspective, this is really too large of a molecule to simulate, and so that's not really a tractable approach. So I'm showing on this slide a genome map of AAV. There are sort of two really major protein coding regions, and I'm focusing on the cap gene here, which codes for this capsid gene. It's about 735 amino acids, the monomer that's produced, and 60 copies of that monomer have to form a complex structure, which is shown here and is highly symmetric, has this beautiful symmetry that we see in so many viral capsids. But having to assemble 60 copies into the structure means that making changes in that sequence of that protein is kind of fraught with difficulty. And so I was quite surprised at the outcomes that we were able to achieve using some relatively simple machine learning models to change the sequence. So progress in this field has been somewhat limited by the requirement that these capsids assemble correctly. So they fold and they assemble into that 16 monomer unit, and that capsid also has to package its genome. So in order for a round of viral replication to work, the capsid has to function correctly, and there's been lots of structure-guided approaches that have been tried, and it's been found to be difficult to work out which mutations are allowed. And in particular, combining lots of mutations, so combining multiple mutations, has been shown to reduce neutralization additively. So if you combine multiple mutations, then you get capsids that work better. But there's sort of a trade-off, because if you add too many, or if you add the wrong combination of mutations, then you end up with capsids that don't fold or package. So being able to sort of walk through this landscape and find sequences that work is really an outstanding problem. And so the question that we asked is, can we build machine learning models that design highly diverse capsid sequences that can still assemble and package their genome? And so this is a little schematic that describes how we actually designed these sequence variants. And this is work that was carried out with experimental collaborators in the Church Lab at Harvard, Eric Kelsick, Sam Sinai, and George Church in this project, and also with a set of research scientists from Google, Ali Bashir, Drew Bryan, and Patrick Riley, helped with the computational aspect of this project. And so we constrained our mutations to a small region of the tile so that it was possible to synthesize it easily using oligos, a small region of the capsid protein, which I'll call tile 21. It picked essentially so that it has a good representation of buried and surface exposed amino acids within that particular region. And we synthesized both single mutants and then designed multi-mutants and tested them in an assay. And so just to give a little more context about that particular region of the tile, there's these sort of buried regions early on in the tile. This is shown in the context of the capsid structure. And then these sort of interface regions between capsid monomers become more surface exposed as we get sort of later in the TAR. And there's a fair amount of diversity in this region naturally if we look across AAV sequences. So there was a complicated experimental pipeline that meant that we could print specific sequences and test them. And our assay here is basically measuring the ratio of sequences of each variant copy number after the experiment to the ratio that was started with. So it's that selection ratio that I've been talking about. And what we found was there was a fair amount of noise in our assay. So here I'm showing a whole set of negative controls, sequences with stop codons that we knew shouldn't work. And you can see there's a bunch of variation in the measurements there, and also a set of positive controls, so versions of the wild type sequence that has synonymous mutations, and there was a whole range of values recorded. And so we decided there was really only one bit of information in this data. We could tell if sequences worked or if they didn't work, and it became a binary classification problem. And when we made all single mutations in that tile, we found that there were some positions early in the tile, in the top half of this heat map, that were very hard to mutate, and then there were other positions both early and late in the tile that were comparatively easy to mutate. And we made an additive baseline where essentially we designed multi-mutants by simply combining the single site outcomes by adding them up. And so we then asked, if we sort of take that model and evolve sequences by walking through sequence space in silico, we found a number of sequences that were predicted to be good, and we tested 56,000 of those designs. And so that's our additive baseline. And so we then asked, well, as I think Andrea remarked earlier, we need to be very careful about how we choose training data. So we tried 3 different training sets for the supervised machine learning models that we built. These training sets had different sizes and they covered different regions of sequence space. We then built 3 different types of models. We also weren't sure what architecture to use. So we had a simple logistic regression model, CNN and an RNN. And we then decided to ensemble each type of model. So we had 11 replicas trained on the same data with different random initializations. And we took a simple vote across those 11 ensembles. So we ended up with 9 models. We had 3 training sets and 3 model types. And each of those 9 models is an ensemble of 11 elements. Lots of models being trained. And these are quite different size training sets. We had the smallest, just contained all single mutations and a small set of random doubles, less than 3,000 training data points. We're allowing actually all single site substitutions and insertions in this experiment. So we're being, I thought this was kind of crazy when we tried it, but it produced some interesting results. So when I say an insertion, we're actually allowing extra amino acids to be added in between the existing ones, which from a structural point of view seems difficult. And so we then took those models, we used them to rank 2.5 billion randomly chosen sequences at different distances from wild type. And we tested the top 100 sequences from each model at each distance from wild type. And then we again used this sort of in silico evolution approach to evolve sequences guided by each of the 9 model ensembles. So there's this whole theme of sort of using models to both select sequences and also to improve sequences. We're really trying to understand if we can use the model to explore the fitness landscape. So what did we find? Well, if we looked at the model selected sequences, we found that in general, those were successful to a point, but once you got to about sort of 8 or 10 steps from the wild type sequence, the precision, the viability of the selected sequences quickly falls off. And so we were sort of surprised that that was so uniform across the 3 different training sets. So I'm showing in here the columns of the 3 training sets. The types of models are shown in different colors. And these are just the ones that were selected by the model. In contrast, we look at the designed sequences, the sequences that the models have evolved. We found that they actually really did much better. They were able to accurately evolve sequences that had 15 or more mutations from wild type. We found that the logistic regression model could be very successful indeed. For this medium-sized training set, we had really amazing success with the logistic regression model, but it was less robust. It didn't do so well for either the large training set or the small training set. So we were a bit perplexed by that. We found that neural network models shown here in blue and green were more consistent across the different training sets in their performance. And the biggest surprise of all was the similarity between the results for the 3 different training sets. We had 3,000 sequences or less in the small set, and more than 60,000 sequences in the large set, and yet we were able to do very well with just a very small amount of training data. So the models could really extrapolate in a way that appears to be useful. And they all outperformed this additive baseline, which is shown here in gray. The additive baseline didn't have access to these sort of additional multi-mutant training data that the supervised models could see. So we didn't actually necessarily think that this would work. We were very surprised by these results. And sort of looking here a little bit at how the different models are making mutations in this tile. So here I'm showing the tile positions on the x-axis, and I'm showing the amino acids on the y-axis. And at the top of each panel are the substitutions, and at the bottom of each panel are insertions. We were very surprised to find that we could insert additional amino acids. These are just the viable sequences. So even early in the tile, we were able to insert, the neural networks in particular were able to insert additional amino acids and for it to work. And the logistic regression model tended to be sort of much pickier about which mutations it inserted, whereas the neural networks were able to sort of get a lot of different amino acids at particular positions to work. I have some logos that give one snapshot of the diversity. This is a little tricky to interpret because early on, when you're close to wild type, the sequences only have a few mutations each, and those tend to go in the latter region, which is more surface exposed. If we look at the sequences that are further from wild type that have more mutations, and of course the mutations are much more spread across the sequence, we can see that the models rediscovered some things that nature had discovered, which is shown in the bottom logo. But there were other things that nature discovered that the models didn't find, and there were things the models found that nature hadn't discovered. So we were quite surprised at the plasticity of this landscape. It seems possible to really change the sequence a lot, much more than I would have previously thought, and I think than other people would have previously thought, and still get viable capsids, even despite those really complex multimeric interactions. And so one last sort of snapshot, I want to talk about the diversity of sequences that the different methods were able to discover. So on the right-hand side, this plot is showing the number of clusters where we've clustered by sequence similarity, and it's shown on a log scale. So there's like really a huge difference in the number of clusters between these different models, and it's shown as a size of as a function of cluster radius. And we can really see that the neural networks were able to discover numerous highly distinct sequences in comparison to either the additive model or the logistic regression model. And so we were quite surprised by this. We could, of course, push the models to discover more diversity by having a more explicit diversity penalty, and we didn't use that, but the neural networks nonetheless sort of did it by themselves. So I want to just finish by giving a plug for a workshop. This is an ICMR workshop that I think people in this community might find interesting. It's on ML interpretability for scientific discovery. They're currently accepting submissions. Deadline is June 9th. And so if you have a relevant paper, they're looking for an extended abstract of 2 to 4 pages. I think that could be a really interesting, some of my colleagues at Google are organizing this, could be a really interesting workshop. Great, so thanks very much.
Thank you, Lucy. So we already have a few questions from YouTube. William McCorkindale asks, is there a reason you chose to explore the landscape using random sequence generator instead of explicit gradient-based exploration?
Well, if I just go back a little bit to that slide, we used the random generation just to give us a starting point. We needed to have a bunch of sort of starting points. We wanted them to be roughly uniformly distributed across the landscape. We didn't want to start all the sequences at wild type and walk from there. We felt it would be good to have a broad distribution of starting point. And so then we used essentially this gradient-based exploration, but just from these different starting points. And we just used the models to rank the starting points to tell us which ones they preferred. So it was really a combination of that random initialization from random points chosen in the sequence landscape and this sort of gradient-based. And we actually, because this is discrete, we did like an explicit sort of search, and local greedy search of the sequence for each step, but it's basically like a gradient-based exploration.
Okay, so the next question is from Aticia Acharya. Question from an out-of-area person. Are we trying to model the evolution here or the sequence after the evolution? Also, how does soft voting compare to the hard voting in the ensemble model of the 3?
So I'll take the first question first. I think we're really trying to mimic evolution in the sense that, we're taking steps and essentially finding out if they work or not. Of course, we're doing a lot of that in silico. So we're trying to sort of build a model of this fitness landscape in silico. The question of whether we're doing this to study evolution or find good sequences, which I think if I understood correctly, that was a question. I think we're doing this for both. Like there's lots of questions wrapped up in this. We don't really know what these fitness landscapes look like for proteins. There's not that much data available, and figuring out how to walk through them has important applications in biotechnology, and is also very interesting from an evolutionary perspective. Has evolution taken all the paths? Has it just sort of explored a small area of the space? Being able to say something about that would be great. But in some sense, by exploring the landscape, we can ask questions about, which paths has evolution taken and which paths has it not. I think that's really interesting, although it wasn't really the focus of this study. The second part about the ensembling, I'm embarrassed to say we didn't actually try different approaches. We found that our models were very certain about the sequences. They either really liked them or really hated them. And so I'm not sure it really mattered how we did the ensembling. Like, I feel that the scores were sort of from the individual model ensemble components were always like 0.99 or 0.01. Like they were very sort of black and white. We certainly should think about both sort of how to do the modeling, how to sort of we didn't really think about uncertainty in the study, which we could have done more explicitly. There are lots of additional things that I think we could have done and we didn't do.
Okay, the next question is from German Sergey. Did you consider using information about conformations of proteins to train your machine learning model? If I'm not wrong, plasticity can depend also on conformation, not only on the amino acid sequence.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And we did try using descriptors that contained information about, for example, how surface exposed each position was in the structure, and sort of how buried or at least sort of structure informed descriptors. We didn't find that they added anything to the performance of the models. We also didn't find that they performed worse. They just didn't make very much difference. I suppose from a structural perspective, I wouldn't have expected basically many of these sequences to work. Like once you've put 15 or so changes into this small region of the tile, and you've included many extra amino acids, like from a structural perspective, that's my prior is that it shouldn't work. And so I think we were anxious not to let that prior constrain us. And that was the reason for the choice that we made. But I think it's a really interesting question. And I don't know enough about how to do high quality simulations to really be able to answer that correctly.
Okay, so the last question that we're going to ask here is from Anul Kara. Are you introducing mutations strictly at random, or do you also target regions that strongly affect protein stability, that is hydrophobic regions? If at random, are you able to learn the regions of higher importance?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So we did really allow the models to pick where the mutations happened. And I think if I go back to this picture, which sort of shows the structural context, this buried region, while not strictly more hydrophobic, was definitely harder to mutate. You can see that, even across the natural sequences, there are more, well, the residues I think are somewhat slightly more conserved here. Certainly across our sequences, we found that the models found it harder to make changes here. In general, I think, including information about the physiochemical amino acid properties, if I recall correctly, we also tried that, and it didn't particularly seem to help. But as a strategy, particularly we're working with sort of larger regions of proteins, that seems like it should be important. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Lucy. So now let's wrap this up and go to the overall panel discussion. So everybody, if you can just turn on your cameras and still keep your microphones off. And I will start it with a question for everybody, and then we'll get a few more questions, I guess, from YouTube, right? So my question, which I wanted to ask is the following. we often hear, and some people have asked these questions even today, that we may not expect necessarily the machine learning methods to discover anything interpretable for us. There shouldn't exist a physics solution, or not shouldn't necessarily exist a physics solution, right? And yet, when we look at all of these problems, be that relaxation or the protein dynamics or immune system or quantum simulations and so on, it seems to be the case that relatively straightforward machine learning methods find interpretable and useful solutions, right? They work. And the question for everybody that I have is why, right? Why do this relatively simple method works? Is there something special about physics problems, or are we just choosing very special problems to work on? And so maybe we can start with that.
Well, this is the so-called unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Is that essentially what you're saying? Or
unreasonable effectiveness in this case of data-driven approaches? I don't know. Do we need to update that old article, right, in view of modern computing and data?
I think there's a really strong confirmation bias here, where most of the time we want to see this happen, and most of the time we want to see machine learning make physics better, and thus we do that. So I think some of it's real, but I think a lot of it's also just confirmation bias.
I'm more optimistic here.
Yeah.
I think there are two separate questions here. One is about the world out there, and one is about cognition. In terms of the world, Eugene Wigner wrote that famous essay, right, about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the sciences. The idea is super old. You can go back to 400 years ago, and Galileo said that our universe is a grand book written in the language of mathematics, right? And you could have then made some testable predictions that if he was right, that our universe really was kind of mathematical, then subsequent science would uncover more. And look what happened. Galileo in his time could predict that a hazelnut and a grape would both fly in parabolic orbits if he threw them, but he had no clue why the grape was green and soft and the hazelnut was hard and brown. And then we got electromagnetism, Maxwell's equations, quantum mechanics, and by now so much more of physics has been described by math. I think the reason that machine learning is also successful in that is telling us something basic about the world rather than about machine learning. Then there's a separate question about this, which is, will machine learning forever be more limited than we human scientists are in extracting these regularities? And I think for those people who say no are basically just betting against the future success of artificial intelligence as a field. If you think that there's something magical about intelligence, such that it can only exist in biological organisms like humans, then of course machine learning will fail. If you think instead that machine learning, that intelligence is really about information processing, and it doesn't matter whether it's processed by carbon atoms or silicon atoms or whatnot, then there's no reason to think that machine learning can't one day be just as good as human scientists at finding these useful patterns.
So just a word on.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to say something after you, Sam.
Okay, go ahead, Andrea. You should. I'll follow up.
Yeah. So I think we could draw probably a distinction between learning things about systems with a few degrees of freedom, where there really are often these very nice simple equations, and systems of many degrees of freedom. Okay. And I think maybe the reason why, the examples that we have talked about today have been successful, are different for these different kinds of systems. And I think for many body systems, what we know is that correlations are really important. And often the correlations are very subtle and hard to find. And machine learning is great at finding correlations. So I think that's partly why it is successful.
Okay, yeah, so actually I want to add something to Andrea's point. So, and this is like, I guess, so Max's comment about like generally the future of AI, and I guess I can't really dispute that, but I want to talk specifically about the way we do machine learning right now, which often has data sets, supervised or unsupervised learning. This is a very limited regime in which you're doing learning, right? But within that regime, Andrea is completely right in that it's all correlation. There's like no way to piece apart causality when you start from a data set and you can't go out and collect more data to verify your theory. It's fundamentally impossible. It's all correlation. And so that's a huge limit, because physics is about causation, not correlation.
Well, often is actually correlation tells us a lot about causation. In fact, often we make use of correlation to understand causation.
I'd push back on that a little bit. I think that you can hold back data and look at it later rather than having to collect it separately. And there's been a lot of progress, right? In recent machine learning conferences we've seen of actually discovering causality with machine learning, going back to primitive things like Ranger causality to more modern ones. So I think we should never say never here.
Okay, let me ask a next question. Okay, I have a few more prepared, but we'll see how far we can get, right? So the topic of the workshop was, can we discover new physics, or do we have to put it in by hand, right? And in a few examples, I would argue that people who presented here at the workshop have discovered new physics, like the softness that Andrea predicted, or the last talk by Lucy. These are situations where we actually have discovered new stuff that we didn't know existed before. And what I want to understand is if we can come to a collective consensus of what are the minimal things that we need to actually put in. I've already heard things like locality is very important. I already heard things that symmetries are very important, but then how do we choose which symmetries to put in and which symmetries do we not put in, you know, which symmetries does the data actually obey, and so on and so forth. And so can we maybe discuss for a few minutes of what is the minimum set of assumptions that need to be put in to actually get some physics out of data?
I think, yeah, I'm gonna. Oh, sorry, Brian, go on. Speak
No,
I was going to jump in and just sort of say that for me, I think simplicity is a really important assumption. There's always so many ways that you can build models for a data set that without that constraint, I think you just kind of, you're lost in a sea of models that all fit the data equally well. And, you know, the physical laws that we know tend to be simple. Maybe that's a very naive assumption, but I think that's important. Brian, please.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean, I just wanted to reiterate that I think that what made your approach really powerful in Andrea's was that you had such a specific question that, I mean, you sort of knew, right? I want to predict which molecules are moving, or I want to predict which sequences are viable, and that is such a key part of this, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say something like that. That I think it's asking the right question. I'm not sure it's the minimal ingredients as much as asking the minimal question.
okay.
And speaking of minimal, I think it's probably a helpful strategy for us to all try to put in some kind of regularizers in our machine learning that penalize complexity and try to find models that are simpler in some form. We've heard many examples of that from many speakers. And I love this quote here earlier that we heard about how physics is not all true statements about nature, but all parsimonious statements. So if we have some way of encoding parsimony and adding it into a complexity penalty into our loss function, right? I think then what we get out will feel a little bit more like physics.
The next question that I have is, in view of what has been happening in applying machine learning to physics in the last decade or so, do we need to change how we think about physics and how we do physics? Are analytical calculations as important as they used to be, or will they continue to be important or not? Should we maybe educate people differently, putting more effort in detecting correlations? Because fundamentally analytics is trying to predict for us what correlations are going to be, and maybe we don't need that anymore, right? And so should we change our view of physics? Should we change it from understanding the laws to just making predictions by any means necessary?
I actually have a pretty strong opinion on that. Really quick, I think that we actually compute too much in physics right now. That was sort of the point of my introduction. So maybe not analytic computations by hand. Maybe that's less important. And maybe we can do more stuff on computers. But fundamentally, I think actually, especially in education, we need to push towards like more philosophical thinking, like more like the things that humans are good at that machines can't do. Like reasoning very abstractly about like what is physics and like what do we hope to like find. Those are our strengths.
Yeah. So I don't know in general, but let me just say that, you know, for our case, for the problem that we did, for me, it did require a conceptual shift. And that is, you know, so as I said, here was a 50-year-old problem, more than 50 years of saying, what is the structure that correlates with rearrangements, right? And what physicists have been doing is saying, I think I know what the physics is. Maybe it's bond orientational order, or it's this, or it's that. And then they would try it, right? And not get anything that was convincing. And it's always trying to boil it down to the one thing that is going to capture the physics that you want and tell you this thing. And the conceptual shift that I think the machine learning brought was to say, let's not just look at one thing. Let's look at many things and many possible predictors. And, you know, that individually might not capture all that much, but then let's try to put them together and see together, can we get a strong correlation, right? And that is a somewhat different way of thinking from what we're used to that turned out to be, I think, quite powerful in this case.
Okay. And here's a great question from YouTube, from Sanghyun Choi. When machine learning gives us an answer that is counterintuitive to humans, how do we know that it's the new physics that has emerged, or that versus that machine learning gave us a wrong answer? So I'm familiar with machine learning. It looks like a black box, and I don't know how to answer that.
How do you ever know if you've got the right answer, right? I mean, this is what we learned over time as physicists, is how to evaluate whether any answer we have makes sense or not. We do all these checks, right? And I think machine learning, that's no exception to that.
And we also do experiments. We have experimental friends.
Experiment. Yeah. There are all these ways that we have of checking whether we have understood something or not.
Okay, I think we're out of time. It's 1:02. So I would like to thank all of the speakers who have stayed with us for the entire duration of this, and for your great talks and for answering the questions. I'd like to thank all the participants who watched us online. And thank you for TR, who has stayed behind the scenes to make sure that everything works. And I hope to do something like that in a few years and see if we can say something different, something new that we haven't yet said today. Well, thank you very much.
And thank you, Ilya. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Ilya.
Thank you.
Great. Bye. Thanks.
Bye.